Imagine a person lying awake in the darkness, mind churning with regret about a decision made years ago, replaying conversations that cannot be changed, dwelling on opportunities missed and paths not taken, feeling the weight of all the small moments that led to their current circumstances, and wondering endlessly what life might have looked like had they chosen differently. This is the opposite of amor fati, the Latin concept meaning to love one's fate, a philosophy developed most fully by the Stoic thinkers and later embraced by philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche as a path toward psychological freedom and inner peace. The mechanism beneath this ancient wisdom is both simple and profound. Resistance to what has already occurred creates a secondary layer of suffering that exists entirely in the present moment, separate from the original event. When we struggle against reality, when we demand that the past should have been different, when we construct elaborate narratives about how things ought to have gone, we create an internal conflict that generates anxiety, depression, and the kind of restless mental agitation that prevents sleep and steals our contentment. Amor Fati inverts this entirely by proposing that we embrace everything that has happened to us, not with resignation or passive acceptance, but with genuine love and affirmation, recognizing that every experience, including suffering and failure, has shaped us into who we are and contributed to whatever wisdom or strength we currently possess. Yet despite the logical clarity of this principle, most of us persist in resisting our own lives, in mentally arguing with the past, in constructing endless counterfactuals about how things could have been better, as if our resistance might somehow retroactively change what has already occurred. We have normalized the habit of rejecting our lived experience, of treating our actual lives as inadequate rehearsals for some other life we imagine we should be living, when in fact the only life available to us is this one, the one we are already inhabiting with all its imperfections and unforeseen consequences included. Consider the peculiar condition of modern life in which we move through our days with an almost perfect amnesia regarding our own mortality, as though we have collectively agreed to pretend that death exists only as an abstraction, something that happens to others or at some distant point in an unknowable future rather than as the fundamental reality that frames every single moment of our existence. We wake, we work, we accumulate possessions and achievements and relationships, we plan for retirement decades away, we worry about trivial matters of status and appearance, and we do all of this while existing under a sentence we know to be true yet systematically refuse to acknowledge. The ancient philosophers understood something that modern culture has largely forgotten, which is that the deliberate contemplation of our own death is not a morbid preoccupation, but rather a clarifying practice that fundamentally reorganizes our priorities and our perception of what actually matters. When you genuinely sit with the fact that your life will end, that your body will cease to function, that everyone you love will either die before you or after you, that all your projects will eventually be abandoned, a strange and counterintuitive effect occurs. The anxiety that we might expect to increase actually diminishes, and in its place emerges a kind of settled clarity about what is genuinely important and what is merely noise. The psychological mechanism at work here is that we live in a constant low-grade existential panic, a background hum of denial and distraction that manifests as compulsive busyness, endless scrolling, perpetual dissatisfaction, and the endless pursuit of more and more and more, because somewhere in our unconscious mind we are running from something we will not name. When you stop running and instead turn to face directly what you have been fleeing, you discover that the monster is not as terrible as the running itself, and in that acceptance, you find a kind of peace. Consider the moment when you lie in bed at night, your body finally still, yet your mind continues to churn with the accumulated friction of the day, replaying conversations that already ended, rehearsing tomorrow's anxieties that have not yet arrived, examining small social interactions for hidden meanings that were likely never intended. You notice how your shoulders remain tense despite the softness of your pillow, how your jaw clenches even though there is nothing to bite down upon, how your breath remains shallow as though you are still bracing for some threat that has already passed. This state of persistent mental disturbance, this inability to settle even when the external conditions for rest are fully present, represents the opposite of what the ancient Epicurean philosophers called ataraxia, a word that translates not as pleasure or indulgence as popular misunderstanding suggests, but rather as undisturbed tranquility, a state of freedom from fear and physical pain where the mind achieves a profound absence of agitation. The mechanism behind this concept rests upon a simple observation. that the human nervous system remains locked in patterns of defensive vigilance long after the stimuli that originally triggered them have vanished, that we carry forward the echoes of threat assessment when safety has genuinely returned, that our minds have become conditioned to manufacture disturbance in the absence of any actual external cause. We have normalized this state of perpetual unease as inevitable, treating the inability to quiet one's own mind as a character trait rather than a learned habit, accepting insomnia and mental agitation as unfortunate facts of modern existence, when the ancient understanding suggested something radically different. That tranquility without external disturbance was the natural resting state toward which the nervous system naturally inclines, and that the burden of mental turbulence we experience is largely self-inflicted through patterns of rumination, worry, and the habitual rehearsal of narratives that serve no protective function whatsoever. Consider the moment when you are learning to ride a bicycle, when every muscle in your body is tense, when you are hyper-aware of the handlebar position, the pressure on the pedals, the angle of your body, and the thousand small corrections you believe you must consciously make to maintain balance. Yet somehow, without your explicit instruction, your body begins to find its own rhythm, and your mind finally releases its grip. And suddenly you are moving forward with a fluidity that requires no thought at all. As though the bicycle itself knows how to balance, and you have become one unified system rather than a consciousness desperately trying to control an external object. This is the essence of Wu Wei, the ancient Taoist principle of effortless action, which teaches that the highest form of accomplishment arises not from force or excessive willpower or the strain of conscious control, but rather from a state of perfect alignment where your actions flow naturally from the present moment without the interference of the ego's constant planning and resistance and doubt. In this state, you are not trying to succeed, you are not mentally rehearsing failure, you are not divided against yourself, but instead you have entered into what modern psychology calls flow, where the boundary between the actor and the action dissolves completely, and yet we spend most of our waking lives doing the exact opposite, swimming against the current of our own nature by exerting tremendous effort to force outcomes, by obsessing over every detail, by creating anxiety through excessive control, by resisting what is, and thereby creating internal friction that exhausts us far more than the actual task ever could. Consider the modern person lying in bed at night, mind racing with the events of the day, replaying conversations, imagining future scenarios, and cycling through emotional reactions to things both real and imagined. The heart quickens at the memory of an awkward interaction, warmth rises at the thought of a pleasant encounter, anxiety tightens in the chest when contemplating tomorrow's challenges. We have come to believe this emotional turbulence is not only normal but necessary, that our passions are what make us human and alive, yet the ancient Stoics understood something profoundly different. They called it apatheia, not the modern meaning of indifference or apathy, but rather a freedom from destructive emotional storms, a state of equanimity where the mind remains undisturbed by the fluctuations of circumstance. The mechanism at work here is subtle but powerful. Our emotions arise not from events themselves, but from our judgments about those events, from the stories we tell ourselves about their meaning and importance. When you feel anxious about the future, you are not actually experiencing the future. You are experiencing a judgment that the future is something to fear. When you feel shame about the past, you are not reliving the event itself. You are experiencing a belief that the event defines your worth. The Stoics recognized that by training the mind to distinguish between what is within our control and what is not, we can release the emotional charge that keeps us awake and agitated. Your reputation, other people's opinions, external outcomes, health, and circumstances are fundamentally not within your control, yet we have normalized a state of constant emotional investment in these things. We have built entire industries and social systems around amplifying passion and emotional reactivity, believing that without this intensity, we would become hollow shells. This culturally reinforced pattern persists despite the obvious evidence that our passionate attachment to outcomes we cannot control is precisely what creates suffering and prevents sleep. Consider the person who moves through each day on autopilot, waking at the same hour, following the same routines, speaking the same words, harboring the same unexamined beliefs, never once pausing to ask whether any of it serves them or aligns with their deepest values. This individual drifts through existence much like a ship without a captain, buffeted by the currents of habit and social expectation, arriving at destinations they never consciously chose. They accumulate years without accumulating wisdom, experiences without reflection, relationships without genuine understanding of what they truly want from connection. The examined life, as Socrates proclaimed in ancient Athens, is the life worth living, yet most people spend their existence in precisely the opposite condition, never turning the light of awareness inward to scrutinize their own motives, desires, and the principles by which they make their most consequential decisions. This happens because the human mind seeks efficiency and comfort, preferring the worn grooves of established patterns to the demanding labor of constant self-inquiry. It requires genuine effort to pause, to question, to wonder whether the path you are walking is truly your own or simply the one laid before you by circumstance and convention. Yet we have normalized this unconscious living so thoroughly that it appears normal, even virtuous, to simply keep moving forward without asking why. The examined life instead invites a different posture toward existence, one where you regularly withdraw from the noise of daily demands to reflect on what you actually believe, what you genuinely want, whether you are becoming the person you wish to be, and whether your actions align with your stated values. This practice of quiet self-examination, when undertaken with honesty and without judgment, slowly dissolves the gap between intention and reality, between the life you think you want and the life you are actually building. Imagine lying awake at night, your mind restlessly cycling through the day's accomplishments and failures, measuring yourself against invisible standards of success and achievement, believing that happiness exists somewhere in the distant future when you finally accumulate enough wealth, status, or recognition to feel complete. This is the exhausting condition of modern life, where we chase external rewards and comparisons without ever arriving at genuine contentment, and where the pursuit of happiness becomes the very thing that prevents us from experiencing it. The ancient Greeks understood something profoundly different through the concept of Eudaimonia, which translates not as simple happiness or pleasure, but as true flourishing or living in accordance with one's essential nature and highest potential. Eudaimonia emerges from a fundamental psychological mechanism whereby well-being arises not from the satisfaction of desires or the accumulation of external goods, but from the consistent practice of virtue and the cultivation of one's character and capabilities. When you align your daily actions with what is genuinely good and meaningful, when you develop wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance through repeated practice, when you contribute meaningfully to your community and grow beyond your previous limitations, the mind naturally settles into a state of deep contentment that requires no external validation or comparison. This ancient insight suggests that flourishing is fundamentally about becoming, not having, about the gradual refinement of your character through intentional effort and reflection, rather than the endless pursuit of objects or experiences that promise satisfaction but deliver only temporary relief. Consider the moment when you encounter a situation that immediately triggers a reaction within you, perhaps a conversation with someone whose views differ sharply from your own, or an unexpected circumstance that challenges your expectations about how the world should function. Your mind rushes forward with interpretations, labeling the experience as good or bad, threatening or benign, worthy of your time or deserving of dismissal. This automatic process happens so quickly that you rarely notice it occurring, yet it shapes every interaction, every emotion, and every decision you make throughout your waking hours. The ancient Greek philosophers, particularly the skeptics, recognized this tendency and developed a practice they called Epoché, which means to suspend or hold back judgment entirely. Rather than immediately accepting or rejecting what you perceive, you create a space between the raw experience and your mental response to it, allowing both to exist without categorization or evaluation. The psychological mechanism underlying this practice recognizes that your judgments are almost always based on incomplete information, personal bias, previous conditioning, and fears that operate beneath conscious awareness. When you suspend judgment, you temporarily disable the filtering system that your mind has constructed over decades of living, which means you encounter reality more directly and with greater clarity than you typically allow yourself to experience. Yet despite understanding this intellectually, we continue to judge instantaneously because judgment offers a sense of control and certainty in an inherently uncertain world. We have normalized the habit of immediate evaluation so thoroughly that the very notion of suspending it feels uncomfortable, even threatening, as though by refraining from judgment we might somehow become vulnerable or lose our sense of self. Consider the moment when you lie down at night and notice a subtle tension in your shoulders, a mild ache in your lower back, or perhaps a faint throb behind your eyes that has been present all day without your full awareness. The ancient Stoics understood something profound about pain that modern medicine is only beginning to validate. Much of what we experience as physical suffering is not the sensation itself, but rather our mental resistance to it, our constant surveillance of it, and our narrative about what it means. Aponia, the Greek concept of absence of pain, was not merely the cessation of bodily harm, but rather the achievement of a state where the mind no longer amplifies, dramatizes, or obsesses over the minor discomforts that are inevitable in human existence. The philosophers recognized that when you cease to focus intensely on a dull ache or persistent tension, when you stop mentally recoiling from it or catastrophizing about its cause, the actual sensation often diminishes or becomes so insignificant that it no longer commands your attention or disrupts your peace. This occurs because pain perception is not a simple one-to-one correspondence between tissue damage and suffering. Rather, it is a complex interaction between the physical stimulus, your emotional state, your expectations, your past experiences, and the degree of your conscious attention directed toward the sensation. Yet we have normalized the habit of mental interrogation, constantly asking ourselves what causes our discomforts, whether they are serious, whether they will worsen, and what we should do about them. We amplify minor sensations into major concerns through the sheer force of our worry and mental focus. The paradox is that this vigilant, anxious monitoring actually increases pain perception and prevents the natural resolution that would occur if we simply allowed our nervous system to relax and our mind to rest elsewhere. Consider the moment you lie in bed at night, your body exhausted, yet your mind continues to spin through worries about tomorrow's meeting, replaying conversations from hours ago, or constructing elaborate scenarios that may never occur. In this moment, you possess the capacity to observe this mental activity as though you were watching it from a distance, noticing the thoughts arise and pass away like clouds crossing an evening sky. The Stoics, particularly Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, called this observing capacity the hegemonikon, the ruling faculty or governing principle of the mind, and they believed that within this faculty lies your greatest source of freedom and peace. This ruling faculty is not the thoughts themselves, nor is it the emotions that seem to overtake you, but rather the conscious awareness that sits behind all of these experiences, capable of choosing whether to engage with them or to let them dissolve without resistance. When you notice that you are anxious, that very noticing is the hegemonikon at work. When you recognize that a thought is repetitive or unhelpful, that recognition comes from your ruling faculty observing the mental activity rather than being consumed by it. Yet despite possessing this remarkable capacity for metacognitive awareness, most people spend their entire lives identified with the content of their thoughts, treating every passing worry as absolute truth and every emotional surge as a command that must be obeyed. We have normalized the surrender of our ruling faculty to the tyranny of reactive thinking, believing ourselves helpless before the forces of our own minds. The paradox that persists is that we have the power to govern our assent, to choose what claims our attention and what receives our agreement, yet we act as though we are slaves to our circumstances and our thoughts. Consider the moment when you lie in bed at night, your mind racing with anxieties about tomorrow's meeting, next month's bills, or a distant fear that something terrible might happen to someone you love. You find yourself constructing elaborate scenarios of failure, rejection, or loss, each one more vivid than the last, and your body responds to these imagined futures with real tension, elevated heart rate, and the inability to fall asleep. This is the human mind's default mode when left unguided, a tendency so automatic that we rarely notice we are doing it, yet it consumes our present moment and steals our peace without delivering any actual protection or preparation. The ancient Stoic philosophers, particularly Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, recognized this pattern and proposed something that seems counterintuitive at first, deliberately practicing negative visualization, but in a controlled, purposeful way that differs entirely from anxious rumination. Rather than allowing your fears to control the narrative, you consciously imagine difficult scenarios with clarity and acceptance, acknowledging them without resistance. When you practice this ancient technique before sleep, you mentally rehearse loss, failure, or hardship in a calm, almost detached manner, not to torture yourself, but to strip these fears of their power to surprise you. The psychological mechanism is profound and unexpected. By deliberately confronting what you are already unconsciously dreading, you transform vague, shapeless anxiety into concrete, manageable thoughts, and in doing so, you paradoxically reduce their emotional charge. Your nervous system learns that imagining difficulty does not create actual danger, and you internalize the understanding that you are capable of enduring hardship. This practice reveals a remarkable truth that we have somehow forgotten in our culture of constant distraction, that anxiety thrives in avoidance and denial, but dissolves when met with calm, rational examination. Consider the modern person lying awake at night, mind racing with certainty about complex matters. Certainty about what others think, certainty about what the future holds, certainty about what they themselves truly want, certainty about why they made the choices they did, certainty about what constitutes success or failure in their life. This person accumulates these certainties throughout the day like stones in their pocket, each one making the burden heavier, each one creating friction and anxiety as they try to rest. The ancient philosopher Socrates taught something radically different, something that dissolves this accumulated weight entirely, the practice of recognizing genuine ignorance, not as weakness but as the beginning of wisdom. He walked through Athens asking supposedly knowledgeable people to explain their most basic assumptions about justice, virtue, courage, and piety, only to discover that these confident citizens could not actually define the very concepts they claimed to understand deeply. The mechanism at work here is profound. Our minds instinctively crave certainty because uncertainty feels dangerous, unstable, and threatens our sense of control. We therefore construct elaborate frameworks of false knowledge, filling gaps with assumptions and convictions that we've never truly examined or tested. We mistake the confidence with which we hold an idea for evidence that the idea is actually true. Socratic wisdom invites us to reverse this pattern, to actively seek out the boundaries of what we genuinely know versus what we merely assume we know. This practice creates a peculiar psychological relief, because once you acknowledge that you don't know something you previously thought you understood, you release the energy spent defending that false certainty. The mind stops tensing against reality and instead relaxes into honest curiosity. What persists despite this clarity is our compulsion to certainty itself, a deeply human need to feel secure and authoritative, to present ourselves as competent and knowledgeable in a world that actually operates far beyond our comprehension. Imagine yourself sitting across from a master teacher who has spent decades cultivating wisdom, and as the conversation begins, you find yourself immediately filling the silence with your own thoughts, your own interpretations, your own need to demonstrate what you already know, and in doing so, you miss entirely what the teacher is attempting to communicate to you. This is the fundamental human condition that the ancient Taoists understood so deeply, the condition of arriving at every moment with a cup already full to the brim, leaving no space for anything new to enter, no room for genuine understanding to take root. The Taoist Empty Cup teaching emerges from this observation, suggesting that true learning, genuine insight, and profound peace can only occur when we approach experience with a mind that is receptive rather than defended, open rather than armored with preconceptions and certainties. The mechanism behind this principle operates on a simple but devastating truth. When your consciousness is already occupied by your existing beliefs, your past experiences, your accumulated opinions, there is literally no space for new information to integrate, no capacity for genuine transformation to occur, because transformation requires the dissolution of what was previously held, and dissolution cannot happen in a vessel already brimming with its contents. This is why the most stagnant periods of human life often coincide with the moments when we are most confident that we understand what is happening, when we have stopped questioning, when we have decided that our cup is sufficiently full and requires no more filling. Yet despite understanding this principle intellectually, we continue to move through our days with the same rigid certainty, the same defensive posture, the same absolute conviction in our interpretations of reality, as if this knowledge had never entered our awareness at all. Consider the person lying awake at night, mind racing through scenarios of potential disaster, the meeting that might go wrong tomorrow, the illness that could develop, the financial collapse that might occur, the relationship that could unravel. This practice of mental catastrophizing feels like responsible planning, a necessary vigilance against an uncertain world, yet it serves no practical purpose in the darkness of the bedroom. The ancient Stoics, particularly Seneca, recognized this human tendency and transformed it into a deliberate philosophical exercise called premeditatio malorum, or negative visualization, which asks us to briefly and calmly contemplate potential difficulties in advance, not to torment ourselves, but to prepare our minds rationally for genuine challenges. The mechanism works through a peculiar reversal of our typical anxiety. Instead of suffering through worry that feels involuntary and uncontrolled, we voluntarily and methodically consider what might go wrong, and in doing so, we discover that most imagined catastrophes lose their power when examined clearly. Our minds naturally catastrophize because evolution equipped us with threat detection systems designed for physical survival. Yet in the modern world, this same mechanism fires constantly at phantom dangers that require no muscle, no action, no fight-or-flight response. We have normalized this state of perpetual low-grade dread as simply the price of consciousness, accepting it as inevitable background noise to our existence, when in truth, the Stoics discovered that a brief, structured period of contemplative worry, conducted with calm rationality rather than emotional panic, paradoxically leaves us more peaceful and more genuinely prepared than hours of anxious rumination. By inviting these fears into our awareness with intention rather than suppressing them or allowing them to bubble up unbidden, we reclaim agency over our own minds and discover that anticipating difficulty with philosophical calm creates resilience rather than fragility. Consider the moment when you receive news of misfortune, a financial loss, a health concern, a social disappointment, and you feel the weight of it pressing against your chest, yet you smile politely and say you are fine, that it is manageable, that worse things have happened to others, that you should not complain when so many suffer more acutely than you do. This is the Stoic reserve clause in operation, a psychological mechanism inherited from ancient Stoic philosophy that permits us to acknowledge difficulty while simultaneously suspending our right to feel its full emotional weight. The Stoics, particularly Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, taught that external events lie beyond our control and that our suffering stems not from the events themselves, but from our judgments about them, our resistance to what is, our insistence that reality should conform to our preferences rather than accepting what has already come to pass. This philosophy contains profound wisdom about resilience and acceptance, yet the reserve clause has transformed into something subtly different in modern consciousness. It has become a permission structure to minimize our own pain before others can minimize it for us, to preemptively prove our strength by denying the legitimacy of our struggle. We tell ourselves that maintaining composure demonstrates wisdom, that expressing vulnerability represents weakness, that the truly enlightened person rises above emotional turbulence through intellectual discipline alone. The mechanism works by creating a hierarchical judgment system where rational acceptance is positioned above emotional honesty, where control is valued above expression, where silence becomes equated with strength. Yet this framework persists despite accumulating evidence that suppressed emotions do not vanish. They accumulate in the body, they emerge in unexpected ways, they create a growing distance between our inner experience and our outer presentation. Consider the moment when you lie in bed at night and attempt to locate the unchanging essence of who you are, that core identity you believe to be fundamentally you, the persistent thing that has remained constant from your childhood to this very moment. You search inward and you find thoughts arising and passing away, sensations blooming and dissolving, emotions that emerge unbidden and vanish without your permission, memories that shift and reconstruct themselves each time you recall them. And yet we maintain the conviction that beneath all this flux there must be something solid, something that is truly and eternally us. The Buddhist no-self doctrine, or anatta in Pali, suggests that this search is fundamentally misconceived because there is no such unchanging core, no permanent essence observing the world, only an ever-shifting collection of physical form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness that we have mistakenly bundled together and labeled as a unified self. What makes this teaching profound is that it operates through the mechanism of attachment and clinging, the way our minds desperately grasp at the illusion of permanence and control, because the alternative seems too destabilizing, too threatening to our sense of security and identity. When we believe firmly in a fixed self, we naturally defend it, protect it, feed it desires, shield it from criticism, and exhaust ourselves in an endless project of self-preservation and self-enhancement. Yet we have normalized this belief so completely that questioning it feels almost heretical, even though moment by moment we experience nothing but impermanence, nothing but constant change flowing through this form we inhabit. The psychological insight here is that by releasing the exhausting fiction of a permanent self, and instead recognizing the fluid, interconnected, ever-changing nature of experience, we paradoxically find peace, because there is no fixed thing to defend, no essential identity to bolster, and no separate self locked in competition with an external world. Consider the moment when you sit alone with a single piece of dark chocolate, allowing it to dissolve slowly across your tongue, and notice how the entire architecture of your anxious mind seems to pause and reorganize itself around this one sensation. Epicurus, often misunderstood as a hedonist who endorsed excess, actually taught that the greatest pleasures came from simplicity, a meal shared with friends, water when thirsty, bread when hungry, and the absence of pain. He observed that humans possess an extraordinary capacity to find profound satisfaction in minimal things, yet we spend most of our lives searching for more complex and costly experiences, believing them to be superior sources of happiness. The mechanism beneath this teaching is neurologically sound. When you concentrate fully on a single modest sensation, your prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for rumination and future anxiety, becomes less dominant, and your sensory cortex activates more completely. This shift in brain activity naturally quiets the endless chatter of worry. We have normalized the belief that pleasure must be elaborate, expensive, or rare to be worthwhile, and we have trained ourselves to overlook the extraordinary contentment available in a warm cup of tea, the texture of clean cotton sheets, or the sound of rain against a window. Yet Epicurus reminds us that we knew this truth once, perhaps in childhood, when a simple fruit or an afternoon of doing nothing felt like abundance. As you rest now, consider allowing your mind to settle not into grand fantasies or future plans, but into the genuine pleasure of your body being held by this bed, of air entering your lungs without effort, of the simplicity of existing without needing anything more than what is already present around you. Consider the modern person moving through their day, bound by countless invisible rules that nobody explicitly taught them, yet everyone seems to follow without question. They wear clothes that match arbitrary seasonal palettes, they speak in filtered language when certain people enter the room, they nod and smile at social rituals that feel empty, and they pursue careers that may hold no genuine meaning for them, all because this is simply what one does. The ancient cynics looked at this precise phenomenon with something between amusement and philosophical horror, recognizing that human beings had collectively agreed to perform elaborate theater while pretending the stage was reality. The mechanism at work here operates through a simple but powerful psychological principle. We internalize the expectations of our social group so thoroughly that we mistake convention for truth, for natural law, for something immutable rather than something that other humans invented. When you see everyone else following a rule, your brain sends signals suggesting that the rule must be important, that deviation carries danger, that conformity equals safety and belonging. The cynics understood that these signals are entirely constructed, that they serve primarily to maintain existing hierarchies and power structures rather than to improve human flourishing or increase genuine happiness. Yet despite this logical recognition, centuries pass and we continue to behave exactly as our parents behaved, wearing the same constraints, accepting the same limitations, pursuing the same hollow victories that left them tired and empty. We have normalized this surrender so completely that suggesting someone live differently marks them as strange, dangerous, or mentally unwell, when in fact they may simply be awake to something the rest have trained themselves to ignore. Consider the moment when you lie awake at night, caught between two conflicting desires, the wish to sleep and the anxiety that prevents it, and notice how your mind reaches for rational explanation as though reason itself were a universal force that could settle the dispute. The ancient Stoics and pre-Socratic philosophers understood something profound about this tendency. They called it logos, the universal principle of rational order that they believed governed not only human thought but the entire cosmos itself. In this framework, logos was not merely logic or language, though it encompassed both, but rather the fundamental intelligence woven through all existence, the rational principle that made the universe comprehensible and coherent rather than chaotic and arbitrary. When you find yourself unable to sleep, you are implicitly believing in this logos even if you do not name it as such, because you assume that your sleeplessness has causes that reason can identify, that your anxiety follows patterns that make sense, that somewhere beneath the turmoil there exists an underlying order waiting to be discovered and understood. This belief has deep roots, extending back through centuries of philosophical tradition that normalized the idea of a universal rationality underlying all phenomena, a cosmic intelligence of which human reason is merely a local expression. The persistence of this belief reveals something curious about the human mind. We continue to trust in universal reason as a stabilizing force, even when our lived experience contradicts its promises, even when rational analysis of our anxious thoughts fails to dispel the anxiety, even when we recognize that understanding the logical structure of a problem does not automatically dissolve the emotional weight it carries. Consider the moment when you lie in bed at night, surrounded by the accumulated certainties of your day. The things you believe you know about yourself, your relationships, your place in the world, and imagine what would happen if you gently questioned every single one of them, not in a paranoid way, but with the patient curiosity of an ancient skeptic. This is the practice that Piero of Eli's advocated for over 2,000 years ago, a radical suspension of judgment so complete that it extends not just to opinions about abstract matters, but to your most fundamental assumptions about how reality actually is. The mechanism behind this ancient technique operates on a peculiar psychological principle, that much of our suffering and mental agitation comes not from events themselves, but from our certain judgments about those events, our unwavering declarations that something is definitely good or definitely bad, definitely true or definitely false. When you practice Pyrrhonian doubt as you drift towards sleep, you begin to notice how many of your certainties are actually built on foundations you have never truly examined, inherited assumptions you accepted without question, because everyone around you seemed to accept them as well. The practice does not ask you to become nihilistic or to believe nothing. Rather, it invites you to hold your convictions more lightly, to recognize that for nearly every belief you possess, someone equally intelligent has held the opposite belief with equal conviction. As you lie still in the darkness and release your grip on needing to know for certain that your worries are real, that your failures matter in the way you think they do, that your future must unfold as you fear it will, something remarkable occurs. The tension that accompanies certainty begins to dissolve, and in its place emerges a quiet acceptance of uncertainty itself. In the classical Chinese tradition, there exists a practice known as the rectification of names, a concept attributed to Confucius himself, which suggests that disorder in society and in the mind arises not from external chaos, but from a fundamental misalignment between what we call ourselves and what we actually are. Imagine a person who identifies as a patient listener, yet finds themselves constantly interrupting others during conversations, or someone who declares themselves a devoted parent while spending their evenings distracted by devices instead of present with their children. The discomfort we feel in these moments, that subtle tension that often keeps us awake at night, replaying these interactions, stems not from judgment by others but from an internal discord, a recognition that the name we have given ourselves does not match the reality of our actions. This misalignment creates a persistent cognitive dissonance that the mind cannot easily reconcile, and so it cycles through the evening hours, attempting to resolve the contradiction. The psychological mechanism at work here is profound. Humans construct a coherent narrative about who they are, and when our behavior contradicts this narrative, our nervous system registers it as a form of internal threat, a falseness that must be addressed. This is not mere intellectual disagreement, but a visceral recognition that something essential about our integrity has been compromised. Yet we have become remarkably adept at normalizing these contradictions, explaining them away through circumstance, through stress, through the complexity of modern life, accepting them as inevitable rather than as signals worthy of attention. The Confucian path to quieting the mind, therefore, begins not with breathing exercises or meditation, but with a careful examination of the names we have given ourselves, a deliberate alignment of our actual conduct with our claimed character, so that when we close our eyes at night, there is no internal voice insisting that we are frauds, no restless anxiety born from the gap between who we pretend to be and who we actually are. Consider the moment when you encounter an idea, a melody, or a mathematical truth, and something within you seems to recognize it as familiar, even though you cannot recall ever having learned it before. You sit with a geometry proof, and suddenly the elegant necessity of it feels not like discovery, but like remembering something your mind has always held in the depths of its being. Plato proposed that all learning is fundamentally an act of recollection, that the soul existed before birth in a realm of perfect, eternal forms or ideas, and that everything we call learning is merely the recovery of knowledge we possessed in that transcendent state before entering the body. When we encounter beauty in the world, we recognize it because we once knew beauty itself in its perfect, immaterial form. When we grasp a universal truth about justice or goodness, we are not acquiring new information, but rather awakening a memory encoded in the soul's essence. The mechanism underlying this theory suggests that genuine knowledge has a quality of inevitability about it, a sense that truth was always already present within us, waiting only for the right circumstances or the right question to draw it forth. We experience this phenomenon regularly in our intellectual and emotional lives, yet we have largely abandoned the metaphysical framework that once explained it. Modern psychology might call this recognition the activation of implicit knowledge or the retrieval of forgotten experiences, attributing it to the brain's vast storage capacity and associative networks. Yet the essential mystery persists. Why does genuine insight feel like remembering rather than learning, and why do universal truths carry with them this peculiar resonance of familiarity? We have normalized this experience without resolving its paradox, moving forward with our daily cognition, while the ancient intuition that something eternal within us recognizes eternal truth continues to whisper beneath the surface of our minds, waiting perhaps for its own recollection. Consider the person who lies awake at night, caught between two opposing forces within their own mind, unable to find rest because they are trapped in the gravitational pull of extremes. On one side stands the voice of relentless ambition, the part of them that whispers they must achieve more, push harder, never rest, never settle for adequacy, and this voice is so loud and so convincing that sleep feels like laziness, like failure, like a surrender to mediocrity. On the other side stands the voice of complete surrender, the exhausted part that wants to abandon all effort, to give up on goals entirely, to sink into apathy and comfort where no demands can reach them. The mind oscillates between these two poles, finding no peace in either extreme, and the body remains tense, alert, unable to transition into the restorative state that sleep requires. This is the condition of imbalance, and it is far more common than we typically acknowledge in our modern world. The ancient philosopher Aristotle proposed something profoundly simple yet remarkably difficult to practice, which he called the golden mean, the idea that virtue and peace exist not at the extremes, but in the conscious middle point between excess and deficiency. In the case of ambition, the mean is not the abandonment of all goals, but rather the cultivation of appropriate striving, the wisdom to know when to push and when to rest, when discipline serves life and when it destroys it. This is not mediocrity in the pejorative sense, but rather excellence through balance, a state where effort and ease coexist without constant conflict. The mechanism underlying this principle rests on the observation that the human nervous system cannot sustain peace when it is forced to choose between two extremes. Yet we have normalized this very condition, celebrating those who sacrifice sleep for achievement and pitying those who have given up entirely, never pausing to consider that both positions are failures of wisdom. Both products of imbalance that leaves the mind unable to settle into the natural rhythms it requires for restoration and genuine flourishing. Consider the moment when you wake from a vivid dream, and for those first few seconds, you cannot distinguish between what you experienced in sleep and the reality now surrounding you. The ancient Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi described a dream in which he transformed into a butterfly, fluttering freely through gardens and meadows, experiencing the world entirely as that creature would experience it, with no awareness of being Zhuangzi at all. When he awoke, he faced a profound uncertainty that has echoed through centuries of human consciousness. He could not definitively know whether he was Zhuangzi who had dreamed of being a butterfly, or whether he was a butterfly now dreaming of being Zhuangzi. This is not merely a poetic fancy or a riddle without purpose, but rather an observation about the fundamental nature of identity and consciousness that cuts to the heart of how we construct our sense of self from moment to moment. The mechanism underlying this insight is that our sense of continuous identity depends entirely on memory and narrative continuity, yet both of these are constructed by the mind itself, making them inherently unreliable witnesses to our own nature. We assume that our present waking consciousness is somehow more real or more true than our dreams because it appears more stable and shared with others, yet both states feel equally real and convincing while we are experiencing them. Throughout our daily lives, we have normalized this fundamental uncertainty by simply refusing to acknowledge it, by accepting the arbitrary designation of our current state as real while dismissing our dreams as mere fabrications, even though there is no logical basis for this hierarchy of reality. As you lie in the darkness before sleep, this ancient paradox invites your mind to release its grip on the need to know exactly what is happening, what is real and what is merely constructed, allowing you a gentle descent into the very dissolution of boundaries that Zhuangzi described, where the question of who or what you are becomes less urgent and more fluid with each breath. As you lie in bed at night, your mind spirals through the events of the day, replaying conversations and worrying about tomorrow's obligations, and you find yourself unable to settle into the stillness required for sleep because your attention has become trapped in the external world and its endless demands. This is the very condition that the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius sought to remedy through his practice of retreating inward, a deliberate movement of consciousness away from the chaos of external circumstances and toward the quiet sanctuary of one's own mind. The mechanism at work here is profoundly simple yet challenging to implement. When you consciously withdraw your attention from what you cannot control in the world around you and instead direct it toward your own thoughts, your judgments, and your values, you create a psychological space where peace becomes possible because you are no longer fighting against reality, but instead examining your relationship to it. Marcus Aurelius understood that the turmoil we experience does not arise from events themselves, but from our judgments about those events, and by retreating inward, by examining these judgments with curiosity rather than resistance, we can transform our suffering into understanding and our anxiety into acceptance. Yet despite knowing this truth intellectually, we persist in directing our energy outward, constantly checking our devices, worrying about others' opinions, and rehearsing scenarios we cannot control, as though maintaining this external vigilance somehow grants us safety or control, when in reality it only exhausts us and prevents the deep rest our nervous system desperately needs. The practice of inward retreat asks you simply to notice where your attention has gone and gently guide it back to your breath, your body, your own quiet inner witness that observes without judgment, until gradually the external world loses its grip and you discover that peace was always available to you, waiting in the sanctuary of your own mind. Consider the person who lies awake at night lamenting the brevity of their existence, convinced that time has slipped away before they truly began to live, that decades have vanished in what felt like mere moments, and that death approaches with an inevitability that renders all their efforts and accomplishments somehow hollow and insignificant. They find themselves caught in a peculiar paradox where they simultaneously waste hours scrolling through endless content, attending obligatory social gatherings that drain rather than nourish them, and pursuing ambitions that were never truly their own, but rather inherited from societal expectations or family pressures. This person complains endlessly about having no time, yet fills their days with activities that feel compulsory rather than chosen, mechanical rather than meaningful, and distinctly unfulfilling. The Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca, writing in the 1st century, identified this very condition and proposed a radical reframing that shifts the entire burden of responsibility. He argued that life is not short at all, but rather that we make it short through our choices, our distractions, our refusals to live deliberately and with intention. The mechanism at work here involves a fundamental confusion between time passing and time being lived, between quantity and quality, between mere existence and actual engagement with existence. We accept the cultural narrative that we are helpless victims of time's passage, that life moves too quickly through no fault of our own, that everyone around us is equally overwhelmed and rushed, and therefore we need not examine our own complicity in this state. Yet Seneca suggests that when we look honestly at how we spend our hours and days, we discover that we have surrendered vast portions of our lives to things we do not value, people who do not matter to us, and futures that do not belong to us. Imagine standing at the edge of a river at dawn, watching the water flow ceaselessly past your feet, and you might recognize the paradox that haunted ancient philosophers for centuries. You cannot step into the same river twice, for the water that touched your skin moments ago has already moved downstream, replaced by water that was not there before. This observation formed the foundation of Heraclitus's revolutionary understanding of reality, a doctrine suggesting that change and flux are not merely superficial qualities of the world, but rather the fundamental nature of existence itself, that nothing remains static or permanent, and that all things exist in a state of constant transformation and becoming rather than stable being. Consider your own body as you drift towards sleep, molecules being exchanged with the air around you, cells dying and regenerating, thoughts flowing one into another without clear boundaries or fixed points of rest. And yet you maintain a sense of continuity and identity throughout this ceaseless biological and mental change. The psychological mechanism underlying this apparent stability, amid flux operates through our mind's extraordinary capacity for pattern recognition and continuity bias, allowing us to perceive coherence and sameness even when examining objective evidence of perpetual alteration, much like how a film creates the illusion of smooth motion from thousands of discrete, unchanging frames. We have normalized this paradox so thoroughly that we rarely acknowledge the strangeness of claiming to be the same person we were a decade ago. When every atom composing our physical form has been replaced, every memory has been reconstructed countless times, and our fundamental values and beliefs have shifted beyond recognition. Consider the moment when you lie in bed at night and notice how your mind constantly grasps at thoughts, memories, and sensations that seem real and substantial in the darkness. You worry about tomorrow, replay conversations from yesterday, feel the weight of your body against the mattress, and sense the boundary between yourself and the world around you. All of these experiences present themselves to you as distinct things that exist separately. Your anxiety exists as one thing, your body as another, the room as yet another. This is how consciousness naturally organizes itself through the act of perceiving and naming different elements of experience as if they are fundamentally separate and solid entities that possess independent reality. The ancient Greek philosopher Parmenides proposed something radically different that challenges this seemingly obvious perception. He argued that only true being exists, and that this being must be eternal, unchanging, and indivisible. According to his logic, anything that changes or ceases to exist is, in some sense, not truly real because it transitions from being to non-being. Moreover, true being cannot have empty space or void within it or around it, because void would be non-being, which cannot exist. This reasoning led him to conclude that multiplicity, change, and differentiation are illusions created by the senses and unreliable opinions rather than true knowledge. What makes this philosophy so subtly powerful for the mind preparing for sleep is that it invites you to release your habitual belief in the fragmented nature of experience. When you stop insisting that your thoughts are separate from your body, that your body is separate from the world, and that all these things are genuinely changing and unstable, a different quality of stillness becomes available. Your constant mental effort to maintain these distinctions and chase after changing things naturally exhausts itself. Consider the experience of lying in bed at night, feeling the weight of your body against the mattress, sensing the walls of your bedroom around you, aware of the ceiling above and the floor below, enclosed within what feels like a defined and measurable space. Yet simultaneously, you might find yourself thinking about infinity, about the vast cosmos extending endlessly in all directions, about the origins of everything that exists, and in this moment of contemplation, the small room you occupy seems to dissolve into something far larger and more fundamental. This is the paradox that Anaximander, the ancient Greek philosopher, spent his life trying to understand and articulate. He proposed that all things in existence emerge from and return to what he called the Aperon, a term often translated as the boundless or the infinite, something without limits, without definition, without measurable boundaries. Unlike his predecessors who suggested that reality originated from a single definable element like water or air, Anaximander recognized that such limiting principles could not adequately explain the diversity and complexity of all existence. The mechanism underlying this thinking involves recognizing that any bounded, defined thing must have emerged from something that preceded it and transcended it, something that cannot itself be limited by form or quality, because if it were limited, it would not be ultimate. This boundless source, Anaximander argued, must be neither wet nor dry, neither hot nor cold, neither this nor that, but rather the unlimited potential from which all qualities and all things continually arise through a process of separation and differentiation. Consider the modern person lying awake at night, their mind cycling through concerns about productivity, achievement, and the accumulation of material success, believing that contentment will arrive only when certain external conditions have been met and certain possessions have been acquired. Yet Democritus, the ancient Greek philosopher who lived over 2,000 years ago, proposed something radically different through his concept of cheerfulness as a deliberate goal rather than a byproduct of fortune. He argued that true peace of mind, what the Greeks called euthymia, emerges not from endless striving for external validation or the gathering of wealth, but rather from the cultivation of a specific mental state characterized by modest desires, philosophical reflection, and the deliberate choice to find joy in simple and available things. The mechanism operating beneath this philosophy rests on a fundamental observation about human psychology. Our minds possess an inherent capacity to adapt to circumstances, to find meaning in limitation, and to generate contentment through the direction of attention itself. Yet we have constructed entire systems of culture and commerce that systematically train us away from this capacity, instead directing our focus perpetually outward toward horizons that recede as we approach them. Consider how throughout human history, across nearly every culture and civilization, people have constructed elaborate images and statues of their gods, depicting them with human features, human emotions, and human desires, assuming with absolute certainty that these representations captured the true nature of the divine. Yet the ancient Greek philosopher Xenophanes observed something peculiar about this universal human tendency that would challenge the very foundation of religious thought. He noticed that the Ethiopians depicted their gods as black with thick lips, the Thracians imagined theirs with red hair and blue eyes, and the Egyptians crafted their deities in their own image, each culture convinced beyond doubt that they alone had glimpsed the authentic face of the sacred, revealing a pattern so consistent that it became impossible to ignore. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through what we might recognize as projection, wherein the human mind, confronted with the infinite and unknowable, instinctively retreats into the familiar by remaking the divine in its own image, thereby rendering the incomprehensible comprehensible through the lens of human experience and human form. This psychological mechanism persists not because it is logically sound, but precisely because it provides comfort and certainty in the face of cosmic uncertainty, transforming the terrifying vastness of the unknown into something recognizable, something that shares our appetites and our moral frameworks, something that validates our own existence by mirroring it back to us on a grander scale. What makes Xenophanes' observations so quietly revolutionary is that he did not condemn this impulse, but simply invited us to notice it, to recognize that if cattle could draw, they would draw their gods as cattle, that our theological certainties reveal less about heaven and more about ourselves. And in accepting this fundamental limitation of human perception, we begin to release the anxiety of needing to possess complete knowledge of ultimate reality. In the ancient city of Corinth, there lived a philosopher named Diogenes who rejected the conventions of his society so thoroughly that he made his home inside a large ceramic barrel, sleeping on straw, wearing only a single ragged cloak, and owning nothing but a wooden cup and a walking staff. When a wealthy merchant once offered him a spacious house and fine furnishings, Diogenes refused without hesitation, explaining that he already possessed everything necessary for a contented life. The story suggests that one day, while Diogenes sat in his barrel eating lentils, a more successful philosopher passed by eating expensive figs and remarked that if Diogenes would only flatter the powerful, he could abandon his meager diet. Diogenes replied that if the wealthy philosopher would only learn to be satisfied with lentils, he could abandon his need to flatter anyone at all. This ancient anecdote reveals a profound psychological mechanism at work within human consciousness. The recognition that contentment exists not in the accumulation of external possessions or social status, but rather in the deliberate reduction of unnecessary desires and the cultivation of satisfaction with simplicity itself. The mechanism operates through a reversal of our normal thinking patterns, where instead of asking what we must obtain to feel fulfilled, we ask instead what we might willingly abandon, discovering in the process that most of what we pursue brings neither lasting peace nor genuine security. Yet despite understanding this principle intellectually, despite reading about Diogenes and countless other philosophers who demonstrated the freedom available through voluntary simplicity, modern people continue to organize their lives around the acquisition of more possessions, higher status markers, and increasingly elaborate experiences that promise satisfaction but consistently fail to deliver it. We have somehow normalized the perpetual dissatisfaction that comes from an endless treadmill of wanting, as though the constant striving itself has become the unexamined goal rather than a means to some genuine contentment we claim to seek. Imagine yourself lying in bed at night, your mind replaying a conversation from earlier in the day where someone said something unkind or dismissive to you, and you find yourself constructing elaborate responses, imagining how you should have replied, feeling the weight of embarrassment or anger settle into your chest as if the moment were still happening in real time. Even though hours have passed and the person is no longer present and the words cannot be unsaid or changed no matter how many times you rehearse them in your mind. This is the experience of attempting to control what lies entirely outside the sphere of your actual power, and it is one of the most exhausting and futile exercises the human mind can undertake. The ancient Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who himself was enslaved and suffered physical torment, observed that there exists a fundamental dichotomy in human life between what is within our control and what is not. And he taught that the path to tranquility begins precisely where we learn to distinguish between these two categories with absolute clarity and precision. Within our control, Epictetus insisted, are only our judgments, our desires, our aversions, our intentions, and our beliefs about things, while entirely outside our control are our body, our possessions, our reputation, our status, and the actions and opinions of others, and most importantly, the past itself, which has already crystallized into unchangeable fact. The mechanism by which we torture ourselves is the habitual assignment of our emotional energy and mental effort toward the domain of things we cannot influence, creating a psychological friction that generates anxiety, resentment, rumination, and the sensation that life is somehow unfair or that we have failed, when in reality we have only failed to accept the boundaries of human agency as they actually exist. We have normalized this self-torment so completely that it feels like responsibility, like caring, like taking things seriously, when in truth it is only the mind's misguided attempt to retroactively control what never was under our dominion to begin with. Consider the moment when you lie awake at night, caught in a loop of worry about something that has not yet happened, something that exists only in the theater of your imagination, a future event that your mind has constructed with such vivid certainty that your body responds as though it were already occurring in the present moment. You feel the tension in your shoulders, the quickening of your breath, the heaviness in your chest, all triggered by a thought, by a proposition your mind has accepted as true without any evidence from the external world. This is the human condition that Chrysippus of Soli, the ancient Stoic logician, spent his considerable intellect examining and attempting to resolve through the power of rational analysis. Chrysippus understood that between the event itself and our suffering about that event exists a crucial middle ground, our judgment, our assent to the proposition, our logical acceptance of a particular interpretation of reality. He recognized that we do not suffer because difficult things happen to us, but rather because we have assented to certain propositions about what those things mean, and this assent, this internal agreement, is entirely within our rational control. When you examine your nighttime worries with the clarity that Chrysippus advocated, you begin to notice the logical structure of your anxious thoughts. You see where you have made leaps without evidence, where you have treated possibility as certainty, where you have confused what is within your control with what is not. By applying this ancient logical method to your anxious mind, by questioning each thought as a proposition that requires evidence and rational justification, you create distance between yourself and the automatic acceptance of fear as fact. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the mind begins to release its grip on the day's concerns, there emerges a subtle longing for something beyond the individual self, a yearning that Plotinus, the 3rd century philosopher, would have recognized as the soul's natural inclination toward reunion with the source of all existence. Plotinus taught that reality flows outward from an ultimate principle he called the One, a transcendent unity so perfect and complete that it requires no division, no multiplicity, no separation into subject and object, and that all conscious beings carry within them an intrinsic desire to return to this primordial state of undifferentiated wholeness. When we lie in bed with our thoughts gradually dissolving, when we notice how the boundaries between self and surroundings become increasingly blurred as we approach sleep, we are experiencing something akin to what Plotinus described as the mystical ascent back toward the One, a movement away from the fragmented, endlessly categorizing intellect toward a state of simple, unified awareness. The psychological mechanism operating here involves the nervous system's natural transition into parasympathetic dominance, where the interior default mode network begins to quiet and the sense of separate selfhood softens. Yet Plotinus would suggest that this is not merely a biological process, but rather a profound philosophical truth about consciousness itself. That the soul remembers its origin and instinctively gravitates toward reunion with ultimate reality whenever the noise of individual thought subsides. We have normalized this nightly dissolution of ego as merely a medical necessity, a homeostatic reset, yet the intensity with which we crave sleep and the profound relief we feel when surrendering to it reveals something deeper that science alone cannot fully articulate, a metaphysical homesickness encoded into the very fabric of conscious existence. Imagine yourself standing before an enormous wheel, slowly rotating in the darkness of time, and upon this wheel are positioned all the circumstances of your life, your victories and defeats, your moments of prosperity and your seasons of loss, your periods of health and your intervals of suffering. The medieval philosopher Boethius, who himself experienced a dramatic reversal of fortune when he fell from the favor of the king, and was imprisoned, awaiting execution, conceived of fortune not as a moral force or a reward system, but as an entirely impersonal, mechanical turning that lifts some to the heights while dropping others to the depths with perfect indifference. This wheel turns continuously, without pause, without preference, without judgment, and the philosophical insight here is that your current position on this wheel, whether you find yourself at the top or languishing at the bottom, is neither permanent nor a reflection of your worth or your virtue. The mechanism at work is beautifully simple, yet profoundly unsettling. If fortune is truly blind and truly mechanical, then your suffering during difficult times is not punishment for wrongdoing, and your joy during prosperous times is not validation of your goodness. What makes this concept psychologically powerful is that it dissolves the ego's need to interpret every circumstance as meaningful commentary on the self. And yet we continue to construct narratives around our fortune, telling ourselves elaborate stories about why we deserve our circumstances or why we have been unfairly treated. We remain attached to the idea that life should be stable, that we should remain at the top once we reach it. That descent is somehow wrong or unexpected. When Boethius understood that the wheel's turning is as natural and inevitable as the seasons changing, and resistance to this truth creates far more suffering than the circumstances themselves ever could. Consider the modern person lying awake at night, mind racing with endless refinements and improvements to their life, their work, their relationships, their appearance, their status, their achievements, constantly sculpting and reshaping every aspect of their existence into something they believe must be perfected and polished to be worthy of acceptance. Laozi, the ancient Chinese philosopher, spoke of the uncarved block, or pu in Chinese, a concept describing the state of original simplicity that exists before all the carving away begins, before society and ambition and fear teach us to shape ourselves into increasingly complicated forms. The uncarved block is not rough or unfinished in a negative sense, but rather whole and complete in its naturalness, possessing an inherent utility and authenticity that requires no improvement, no decoration, no additional craftsmanship to make it valuable. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the human tendency to believe that our worth and peace of mind depend upon constant self-improvement and the endless refinement of our circumstances, when in fact this very process of carving away at our original nature, adding layers of complexity, managing countless self-created expectations, is precisely what generates our anxiety and prevents genuine rest. We have normalized this state of perpetual self-sculpting so thoroughly that we have forgotten what it feels like to simply be, to exist without immediately assessing what should be changed, improved, optimized, or perfected about ourselves or our situation. The irony lies in the fact that this relentless pursuit of improvement often diminishes rather than enhances our actual functioning, our peace, and our capacity for sleep. Yet we continue this carving away as though it were the only path to worthiness, not recognizing that we began as the uncarved block, and that our deepest peace emerges only when we allow ourselves to return to that original, whole, uncomplicated state of being that required no improvement then and requires none now. Consider the moment when a child totters toward the edge of a well, and a stranger nearby feels an immediate surge of alarm and compassion, moving without thought to pull the child back from danger. This instinctive response, this spontaneous rush of empathy and protective action, forms the cornerstone of Mengzi's revolutionary claim about human nature, a claim that fundamentally contradicted the prevailing philosophies of his time. Mengzi, the 4th century Confucian philosopher, argued that humans are inherently good, possessing within themselves seeds of compassion, righteousness, propriety, and wisdom that exist from birth, waiting only to be nurtured and cultivated like a garden tended with care and attention. He observed that this goodness manifests not through rational deliberation or external coercion, but through spontaneous emotional responses that arise when we witness suffering or injustice, a kind of moral intuition that springs from something deeper than learned behavior or social conditioning. The psychological mechanism underlying this philosophy rests on the observation that conscience and empathy appear naturally in human behavior, even among those who have received no formal moral instruction, suggesting that morality is not imposed upon us from outside, but rather emerges from within our nature itself. This innate capacity for goodness, according to Mengzi, requires cultivation and protection in the same way that a sprout requires soil, water, and sunlight to grow into a mighty tree. For the conditions of life, poverty, hardship, and the corrupting influence of poor examples can obstruct and distort this natural inclination toward virtue. Yet despite the logical power of this observation, and despite our own repeated experiences of spontaneous kindness and moral sensitivity, modern societies have largely normalized the assumption that humans must be controlled, regulated, and motivated through fear, punishment, and external reward, as though our natural state were one of selfishness rather than goodness. Consider the moment when you lie awake at night, mentally grasping at a problem that has troubled you throughout the day, turning it over and over in your mind as though the sheer force of your attention might dissolve it into something manageable, only to find that the more intensely you focus upon it, the more solid and immovable it becomes, the more real it seems to possess an inherent, unchanging nature that exists independent of your relationship to it. This is the ordinary human condition, the way we habitually relate to our thoughts, our circumstances, and our sense of self as fixed entities with permanent identities. The ancient Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna, who lived in India during the 2nd century, taught a radical liberation from this exhausting mental posture through the concept of emptiness, not as blankness or void, but as the absence of independent, intrinsic existence in all phenomena. What makes this teaching so profoundly calming is that it demonstrates through rigorous logical analysis that nothing you worry about possesses the solid, self-sufficient nature you intuitively assume it does. Every object, every thought, every circumstance exists only in relationship to other things, in dependence upon causes and conditions, upon perspective and definition, and time itself. The mechanism by which this teaching soothes the worried mind is elegant in its simplicity. When you genuinely understand that the problem keeping you awake has no intrinsic, unchanging essence, when you recognize that it exists only as a conceptual designation dependent upon countless factors beyond any single perspective, the grip of anxiety naturally begins to loosen. The paradox that persists in ordinary consciousness is that we continue to cling to things as though they were permanent and independent, even as every moment of lived experience contradicts this assumption, even as we witness constant change, interdependence, and transformation all around us. Consider the moment you lie in bed at night and become aware of the room around you, the shadows on the wall, the distant sound of traffic, the texture of your pillow beneath your head. You experience these as external objects, separate from yourself, existing independently in a world outside your consciousness. Yet the Buddhist philosopher Vasubandhu, writing in the 4th century, proposed something that dissolves this assumed boundary entirely, that everything you perceive, every sight and sound and sensation, is in fact a manifestation of mind alone, not the impact of an external reality upon a passive consciousness. What you call the external world is actually the mind creating and experiencing its own contents simultaneously, like a dream that feels entirely real while you are dreaming it. The room you believe exists outside you is actually a construction of your awareness, and the you that seems to be observing that room is itself part of that same mental construction. This is not mysticism or delusion, Vasubandhu insisted, but a logical observation about the nature of perception itself. You have never actually encountered a world independent of your awareness of it. You have only ever encountered your awareness itself, shaped and organized in particular patterns. The mechanism becomes clear when you recognize that all knowledge comes through the mind, filtered through consciousness, interpreted by the structures of perception and cognition. There is no way to step outside your mind to verify that an external world exists separately from it. Even the most rational analysis of reality occurs within the mind analyzing itself. Yet despite this fundamental logical position, you continue to treat the external world as fundamentally separate from yourself, as something objective and unchanging that exists regardless of your awareness. You have normalized this assumption so completely that it feels like direct perception rather than a construction. Consider the ancient paradox posed by Zeno of Elea, the Greek philosopher who challenged the very notion of motion and completion by imagining a race between the swift Achilles and a humble tortoise, where the tortoise, given even the slightest head start, could theoretically never be caught because Achilles must first reach the point where the tortoise began, then the point where it moved to next, then the next, creating an infinite sequence of pursuits that logic suggests should take infinite time to complete. This paradox, though mathematically resolved in modern times through our understanding of infinite series and limits, reveals something profound about human patience and our relationship with incremental progress. For we live constantly in this Zenonian trap of our own making, where we find ourselves perpetually chasing goals that seem to recede before us with each step forward we take. In daily life, we see this reflected in the ambitious person who begins a project, knowing they must master countless prerequisites before genuine progress can manifest, or the student facing years of education before reaching competence, or the person working toward healing from trauma who must revisit pain again and again in smaller increments before wholeness emerges. And in each case there exists a moment of profound doubt where the infinity of remaining steps feels more real and more overwhelming than the finite distance already traveled. The psychological mechanism underlying this experience involves our mind's tendency to focus on the absolute gap remaining rather than the asymptotic progress we are making. Combined with our narrative need for definitive endpoints and clear victories in a world that actually operates through gradual, continuous transformation, where completion is a conceptual convenience rather than an absolute reality. Consider the ancient Greek philosopher Thales of Miletus, who lived in the 6th century before the Common Era, a man whose curiosity about the natural world led him to propose a radical idea that would echo through centuries of human thought. That water is the fundamental substance from which all things originate and to which all things eventually return. Imagine standing beside him as he observes the world with meticulous attention, noticing how seeds require moisture to germinate, how all living creatures contain moisture within their bodies, how heat itself seems to require the presence of water to create life, and how even the earth itself appears to need water to remain fertile and capable of sustaining existence. He watches the rivers flow, observes the rain nourish the soil, sees the blood and vital fluids within animals, and concludes that beneath the apparent diversity and complexity of the material world lies a single unifying substance: water. This theory represented one of humanity's first attempts to reduce the overwhelming multiplicity of existence to a single fundamental principle, to find order and unity within apparent chaos. The psychological mechanism at work here is the human mind's deep need to simplify complexity, to find patterns that connect disparate observations into a coherent whole, to move beyond surface appearances towards some underlying truth that might explain everything. Thales was engaging in what we might call reductive reasoning, the impulse to trace all phenomena back to their common source, to find the thread that weaves all of existence together. Yet despite the eventual discovery that water is merely one compound among countless others, despite our modern understanding of chemistry, physics, and the true diversity of matter itself, there remains something profoundly comforting about Thales' vision, something that persists in how we still regard water with a kind of reverence and necessity, still recognize its centrality to all organic life, still speak of water as life-giving and essential in ways that transcend pure scientific fact. Close your eyes and imagine yourself in ancient Greece, where a philosopher named Pythagoras discovered something that would reshape how humans understand the world around them. He noticed that musical intervals, those relationships between sounds that create harmony or discord, could be expressed as simple mathematical ratios. When two strings vibrate in the ratio of 2 to 1, they produce notes that sound harmonious together, creating what we call an octave. When the ratio is 3 to 2, we hear a perfect fifth, a sound so naturally pleasing that civilizations across continents independently discovered it. This observation became the foundation of what Pythagoras called number harmony, the belief that numerical relationships govern not just music, but all of existence, from the movements of celestial bodies to the structure of matter itself. The mechanism underlying this insight rests on a profound truth about vibration and resonance. When objects vibrate at frequencies that share simple mathematical relationships, they naturally reinforce each other, creating patterns of constructive interference that our ears and minds perceive as beautiful. This is not merely aesthetic preference, but reflects something deeper about how waves and patterns interact in physical reality. Our brains appear naturally attuned to recognize and appreciate these mathematical relationships, suggesting that we ourselves are constructed according to the same harmonic principles that govern the universe. What remains remarkable is how deeply this ancient observation persists in our modern consciousness without our conscious awareness of it. We continue to organize music according to these Pythagorean ratios. We find certain proportions in nature and architecture inherently pleasing, and we sense an underlying order to existence through mathematical beauty, all while rarely considering that we are experiencing the direct legacy of insights glimpsed over 2,000 years ago in the Mediterranean sun. Consider the ancient Greek philosopher Empedocles, who proposed that all existence arises from the eternal dance between two cosmic forces: love, which brings things together and creates unity, and strife, which tears things apart and creates separation. In our modern lives, we experience this principle constantly without naming it. We feel drawn toward people, projects, and pleasures that unite us with something greater than ourselves, yet simultaneously we feel an opposing force that compels us to resist, to question, to create distance and individuality. This tension manifests in relationships where intimacy and independence wage their endless conflict, in creative work where inspiration and self-doubt alternate like breathing, and in our own minds where the desire for peace wars eternally against the restless impulse to grow and challenge ourselves. The psychological mechanism underlying this observation is that stagnation and chaos are equally unbearable, so the psyche naturally generates a rhythmic oscillation between them, seeking not a final resolution but a sustainable pattern of engagement and withdrawal. We push away from those closest to us precisely because we fear losing ourselves in union, and we push toward connection precisely because isolation threatens our sense of meaning. What makes this principle so remarkable is how thoroughly we have normalized this oscillation without ever acknowledging it as a fundamental law of consciousness itself. We treat our contradictory impulses as personal flaws or emotional confusion rather than recognizing them as the necessary mechanics of existence itself. Empedocles understood that this eternal struggle between love and strife is not a problem to be solved, but rather the very condition that makes life, growth, and consciousness possible at all. Consider the moment when you lie in bed at night and find yourself caught in a recursive loop of worry, where one anxious thought spirals into another, and that thought into another still, each one seeming to demand your immediate attention and solution, as if the very survival of your being depends upon solving every problem simultaneously before you can rest. The ancient Greek philosopher Anaxagoras proposed that the universe is ordered by something he called nous, which translates as mind or intelligence, a cosmic principle that arranges all matter into meaningful patterns and structures. What Anaxagoras understood, though he was speaking of the cosmos itself, applies with remarkable precision to the human experience of mental chaos before sleep. When your mind races with concerns about tomorrow's meeting, unpaid bills, relationship uncertainties, and 1,000 small regrets, you are experiencing exactly what happens when you forget that there is an ordering principle available to you, a way to let consciousness itself organize your thoughts rather than letting scattered thoughts dominate your awareness. The psychological mechanism at work is simple yet profound. Your mind possesses the capacity to step back from individual thoughts and observe them as separate phenomena, to allow an organizing intelligence within your own awareness to sort, prioritize, and ultimately release what need not be addressed in the darkness. Yet despite knowing this intellectually, despite the fact that solving tomorrow's problems tonight accomplishes nothing except the prevention of sleep, we persist in treating the wandering mind as though it must be obeyed, as though each thought that arises deserves our full engagement and problem-solving energy. We have somehow normalized the idea that lying awake serves a purpose, that mental agitation equals mental productivity, when in truth the ordering principle within you knows exactly which thoughts matter now and which can be safely set aside for morning. Consider the moment when you sit across from another person and find yourself in disagreement about something that feels entirely objective to you, yet entirely different to them, and in that moment you realize that what you perceive as absolute truth is being perceived by them as something equally absolute but utterly opposite. And this realization comes from the ancient Greek philosopher Protagoras, who declared that man is the measure of all things. Meaning that each individual human being becomes the standard by which reality is measured and interpreted through their own particular senses and circumstances and beliefs. This principle appears in the most mundane situations imaginable. Two people looking at the same painting and one sees beauty while another sees ugliness. Two people tasting the same meal and one tastes salt while another tastes blandness. Two people experiencing the same weather and one feels cold while another feels warmth. And in each of these moments, the philosophical truth that Protagoras articulated 25 centuries ago remains vividly alive, because neither person is objectively wrong and neither person is lying about their experience. The mechanism behind this persistence is that human consciousness does not receive the world as it is, but rather as it is filtered through the individual nervous system, shaped by previous experiences, colored by emotional states, and interpreted through the lens of what each person has learned to value and notice and ignore throughout their lifetime. So that reality becomes not a fixed external thing, but a collaborative dance between the sensing organism and the world being sensed. What makes this philosophical insight so quietly unsettling is that we have built entire systems of law and science and communication on the assumption that objective truth exists independently of the observer. Yet every day we encounter the Protagoras principle asserting itself in arguments about whether something is beautiful or ugly, fair or unfair, right or wrong, where each party measures the world through their own particular humanity and finds themselves completely justified. Consider the moment when you lie in bed at night, surrounded by the physical objects of your bedroom, yet unable to fully convince yourself that anything you perceive truly exists in the way you believe it does. The ancient Greek philosopher Gorgias proposed a radical argument that has echoed through centuries of thought, suggesting that nothing actually exists, that even if something did exist, we could never truly know it, and that even if we could know it, we could never communicate that knowledge to another person. This threefold negation, born from the skeptical tradition of ancient Greece, invites us to contemplate the fundamental unreliability of our perception and the strange gap between the world as it appears to our senses and the world as it actually might be. When you look at a familiar object in your room, you do not perceive the object itself, but rather light waves reflected from its surface, processed through the electrochemical activity of your brain, reconstructed as an image in your mind that bears only a symbolic relationship to the thing itself. Your experience of reality is always mediated, always translated, always filtered through the apparatus of your nervous system, which means that direct access to pure existence remains forever beyond your reach. The psychological mechanism at work here rests on the recognition that consciousness creates distance between the observer and the observed, that the very act of knowing something transforms it into something other than itself, and that language itself, our primary tool for sharing experience, remains fundamentally inadequate to capture the nuances of what we perceive. Yet despite this logical scaffold, we move through our daily lives with an unshakable confidence that the world exists and that we understand it reasonably well, that our conversations convey meaningful truths, and that our experiences connect us reliably to reality itself. Consider the person who believes that justice is simply the advantage of the stronger, that what we call morality is merely a construct designed by those in power to maintain their control over the weak and vulnerable. This belief, articulated most famously by Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic, presents a seductive philosophical proposition that seems to explain much of what we observe in the world around us. When we look at history, at laws that favor the wealthy, at systems that protect the interests of corporations and governments while marginalizing the powerless, the Thrasymachus view appears vindicated by reality itself. We see those with resources and influence bending rules to suit their purposes, writing laws that benefit their class, and creating moral frameworks that justify their dominance. The mechanism operates on a profound psychological level, because once you accept this premise, it feels like you have seen through an illusion that binds others to false beliefs. You believe yourself liberated from naive notions of universal justice, enlightened to the truth that morality is merely power wearing a mask of legitimacy. This framework provides a seemingly rational explanation for injustice and inequality, converting moral questions into questions of raw force and strategic advantage. Yet what persists despite its logical appeal is our continued ability to recognize genuine injustice, our capacity to feel outrage when the vulnerable are exploited, and our stubborn insistence that some things truly are wrong regardless of who benefits from them. We have normalized this cynical view in our discourse, treating it as sophisticated realism, when in truth it may represent a different kind of illusion altogether, one that prevents us from recognizing that our deepest moral intuitions might reflect something real about human dignity and genuine justice that transcends the merely strategic calculations of power. Consider the person who lies awake at night, mind racing with worry about social status, material accumulation, and the opinions of others, unable to find peace despite possessing shelter, food, and safety. Antisthenes, the ancient Cynic philosopher and student of Socrates, observed this very condition in the Athens of his time and proposed something radical. That virtue alone is sufficient for happiness, and that the endless pursuit of external goods is not merely unnecessary but actively harmful to the tranquility of the soul. He taught that what truly matters is the development of character, wisdom, and self-control, and that the person who masters their desires and cultivates inner excellence requires nothing else to experience contentment. The mechanism at work here is deceptively simple, yet profoundly difficult to accept. Our suffering does not arise from lacking material things or social validation, but from believing we need them in order to be complete. When we internalize the belief that virtue, that is, integrity, courage, wisdom, and self-discipline, is the only genuine good worth pursuing, our minds naturally begin to release the exhausting grip of wanting what others have or what society demands we desire. The paradox is that we have known this for millennia, yet we continue to structure our lives and anxieties around the accumulation of precisely those external things antisthenes deemed irrelevant to true peace. We normalize the sleeplessness that comes from keeping up with others, from fearing loss of status, from the endless comparison that exhausts the mind before sleep can come. Yet the ancient wisdom persists quietly beneath our modern anxieties. The moment you stop believing that your worth depends on what you own or how others perceive you, and instead root your sense of self in your own character and ethical choices, a profound quietness becomes possible in the dark hours when your head touches the pillow. Imagine yourself sitting alone in a quiet room as the evening deepens around you, and you find yourself scrolling through your phone, watching videos, checking messages, refreshing feeds, each small notification bringing a momentary spark of interest, a brief dopamine release that feels satisfying in the present instant. You are not planning for tomorrow or next week. You are simply responding to what feels good right now, in this very moment. Aristippus of Cyrene, an ancient Greek philosopher who lived in the 4th century before the Common Era, would have recognized this impulse immediately, for he built an entire philosophical system around the pursuit of present pleasure as the highest good. He did not believe in denying himself immediate gratification for some distant reward, nor did he embrace the ascetic practices that other philosophers advocated. Instead, Aristippus taught that pleasure, understood as the absence of pain and the presence of enjoyable sensations, is the natural aim of all living beings, and that wisdom consists in pursuing pleasures intelligently and moderately in the here and now. The psychological mechanism underlying this philosophy reveals something profound about human nature. Our minds are acutely attuned to immediate sensory experience, far more than to abstract future benefits. When you feel hunger, the impulse to eat arises instantly. When you taste something delicious, the pleasure registers immediately in your consciousness. Aristippus recognized that chasing distant goals often leads to suffering in the present moment, and he questioned whether the promise of future happiness justifies current deprivation. Yet despite the logical elegance of his argument, we have built entire civilizations on the opposite principle. We delay gratification, sacrifice present comfort for future security, work jobs we find tedious in exchange for paychecks that might purchase happiness someday. We have normalized the postponement of our own contentment so thoroughly that we rarely question it, treating present pleasure with suspicion as though it were inherently selfish or morally suspect. Consider the moment when you find yourself lying in bed, unable to commit fully to any single belief about tomorrow, uncertain whether the plans you made will unfold as expected, doubtful of your own decisions from earlier in the day, and questioning whether you truly understand the motivations of those closest to you. This state of perpetual uncertainty, this suspension of judgment about nearly everything, was the philosophical stance championed by Carneades of Cyrene, the ancient Greek skeptic who argued that certainty about anything in the external world might be fundamentally impossible. And yet paradoxically, we must still act, still choose, still move through life as though some things matter and some paths are better than others. The psychological mechanism at work here is remarkably elegant. Carneades recognized that absolute certainty is a standard so impossibly high that nothing in human experience can meet it, and yet abandoning the pursuit of knowledge entirely would make action impossible. So instead he proposed that we operate on the basis of what is probable, what seems reasonable, what appears credible to our minds, without ever claiming that we have grasped absolute truth. This suspension of judgment, this Epoché as it would later be called, does not paralyze us, but rather liberates us from the anxiety of needing to be absolutely right about everything, allowing us to live lightly with our convictions and hold our beliefs with a certain graceful looseness. What is remarkable is how this ancient insight has become normalized in our modern consciousness without us fully recognizing it, for we live constantly in a state of acting upon incomplete information, making decisions despite uncertainty, moving forward despite doubt. And yet we rarely pause to acknowledge that this is precisely the philosophical position Carneades advocated over 2,000 years ago. Consider the moment when you find yourself in a conversation where someone presents a claim with absolute certainty, and you feel the pressure to agree or disagree immediately, yet something in you recognizes that you do not possess enough information to make a confident judgment either way. This is the precise territory that Arcesilaus, the second head of Plato's academy in ancient Greece, explored with remarkable depth and courage. Arcesilaus developed a philosophical practice called Epoché, or the withholding of assent, which taught that when faced with a proposition that claims certainty, you possess the power and indeed the responsibility to neither affirm nor deny it, but rather to suspend your judgment entirely until genuine clarity arrives. Rather than forcing yourself into premature agreement or reflexive disagreement, Arcesilaus recognized that most of what we encounter in daily life arrives shrouded in degrees of uncertainty, and that the honest response is often to acknowledge this ambiguity without shame or anxiety. The mechanism operating here is profoundly simple yet rarely practiced. By refusing to commit your mind to a position you have not fully examined, you liberate yourself from the psychological burden of defending beliefs that may ultimately prove hollow or incomplete. This act of withholding requires a peculiar kind of courage, because our social conditioning teaches us that uncertainty appears weak, that silence implies ignorance, and that we must always have an opinion ready to display. Yet Arcesilaus understood something deeper, that true intellectual strength lies not in the speed of your judgment, but in your willingness to say, with genuine peace, that you do not yet know. This practice has largely disappeared from modern discourse, replaced by a culture where provisional thinking is rare and where binary positions dominate our conversations. We have normalized the assumption that every question demands an immediate answer, that ambivalence is merely indecision, and that withholding assent somehow diminishes our credibility or our presence in the world. Imagine standing alone in a vast landscape at dusk, watching the last light drain from the sky, and feeling not isolation but a strange sense of connection, as though the dimming of the world mirrors something within your own consciousness, and that mirroring itself becomes a comfort rather than a source of loneliness. This experience, which many people encounter but rarely articulate, lies at the heart of what the ancient Stoic philosopher Posidonius called cosmic sympathy, a concept suggesting that all things in the universe share an underlying interconnectedness through which our individual fate becomes inseparable from the fate of the whole cosmos. Posidonius believed that the universe itself was a living organism permeated by divine intelligence, and that humans, far from being isolated fragments of matter moving through empty space, were instead threads woven into a vast cosmic fabric where every event, every sensation, every thought somehow resonates through the entire structure of existence. The mechanism underlying this philosophy rests on the observation that we constantly witness patterns repeating across scales, that the rhythms governing the stars also govern our heartbeats, that the cycles of seasons mirror the cycles of our own lives, and that consciousness itself might be less an accident of biology and more a fundamental property of reality expressing itself through infinite variations. Imagine yourself in a moment of genuine conflict, where what you want for yourself stands in direct opposition to what others need from you, and you find yourself choosing the obligation without hesitation, even when that choice brings you exhaustion, resentment, or pain. Perhaps you stay late at work completing someone else's project when you promised yourself an evening of rest, or you cancel plans that matter deeply to you because a family member has made a request, or you suppress your own opinion in a meeting because maintaining harmony feels more important than speaking your truth. This is the ancient Stoic principle that Panidius of Rhodes developed and emphasized throughout his teachings, the idea that duty and obligation to others forms the very foundation of a well-ordered life, and that personal comfort or satisfaction must always remain subordinate to the fulfillment of your roles and responsibilities. What makes this philosophy psychologically compelling is that it operates through a kind of moral logic, a framework that positions selflessness as the highest virtue and suggests that the person who sacrifices most for others achieves the greatest dignity and peace. When you embrace this thinking, the discomfort of self-denial transforms into something meaningful, even noble, because you have reinterpreted the pain itself as evidence of your moral character. Yet what often goes unexamined is how this principle, when taken to its extreme, can become a tool of self-erasure, a way of perpetually postponing your own needs while convincing yourself that your suffering serves a greater good. We have normalized this to such a degree that we rarely question whether constant duty above self actually leads to the quiet mind we seek, or whether it instead creates a condition of quiet resentment, a soft exhaustion that we have learned to call responsibility. In the ancient world, there existed a profound philosophical poem composed by Cleanthes, a Stoic philosopher of the 3rd century before the Common Era, which served as a meditation on the nature of divine order and human acceptance of fate. This hymn to Zeus was not a prayer in the conventional sense seeking favor or intervention, but rather a contemplative affirmation of the rational principle that governed all existence, a principle that the Stoics identified with Zeus or divine reason itself. The hymn's central insight rested upon the idea that everything that occurs in the universe unfolds according to a necessary and rational order, and that human suffering and difficulty arise not from the gods' malice, but from our resistance to understanding and accepting this natural order. When Cleanthes composed his verses addressing Zeus, he was essentially speaking to the principle of universal reason, acknowledging that even the struggles and pains of human existence serve a purpose within a larger, comprehensible design. The psychological mechanism at work here involves a fundamental reorientation of perspective, where instead of viewing hardship as meaningless or unjust, the mind recognizes it as an integral part of a rational whole, thereby transforming despair into a kind of peaceful resignation rooted not in defeat but in understanding. This practice of affirming the divine order through contemplative acceptance operates by shifting the locus of control from external circumstances to internal assent, allowing the practitioner to experience tranquility not because problems disappear, but because the mind ceases to resist their existence. What is remarkable about this ancient practice is how it persists across centuries in various forms, appearing in prayer, mindfulness, and acceptance-based therapies, suggesting that humans have consistently discovered that mental peace arrives not through changing the world, but through changing our relationship to inevitability itself. Imagine standing at the center of a series of concentric circles, each one representing a different layer of human relationship and responsibility, beginning with yourself at the very core and expanding outward to include your immediate family, then your extended relatives, your neighbors and community, your countrymen, and finally all of humanity itself. This is the ancient concept known as Hierarchal's circle of concern, a philosophical framework developed by the Stoic thinker Hierarchals in the 2nd century, which presents a radically different way of understanding how we should distribute our attention, compassion, and ethical obligations throughout the world. In our ordinary lives, we experience this in a very natural and almost unconscious way. We tend to care most intensely about those closest to us, our children and partners, then somewhat less about our parents and siblings, then considerably less about our colleagues or acquaintances, and perhaps barely at all about distant strangers or people from different cultures or nations. The psychological mechanism behind this arrangement is rooted in our evolutionary history and the simple fact that proximity creates familiarity, and familiarity creates emotional bonds that feel immediate and urgent in a way that abstract concern for distant suffering simply cannot match. Our brains are wired to respond more readily to the specific face of a hungry child we know than to statistics about millions of hungry children we will never meet. And this is not a moral failing so much as it is a practical limitation of human emotional processing. Yet what makes the hierarchical circle such a powerful philosophical insight is that it suggests we ought not accept this natural hierarchy as the final word on our ethical responsibilities. Rather, it proposes that we can and should consciously work to expand each circle, drawing the outer circles gradually inward until we feel a genuine kinship and obligation to all human beings. Consider the Roman Stoic philosopher Musonius Rufus, who taught that the purpose of philosophy was not merely intellectual understanding, but the transformation of how one actually lives from moment to moment, and who believed that every single day presented an opportunity to practice virtue through small, deliberate actions that seemed almost mundane in their simplicity, yet held profound power over the quality of one's inner life. Imagine yourself moving through your day with the awareness that each interaction, each choice, each moment of discomfort or frustration becomes a laboratory for philosophical practice, where you might exercise temperance by eating simply, practice courage by speaking an honest word, or cultivate patience through accepting small hardships without complaint. The mechanism underlying this approach rests on a deceptively simple insight that virtue is not something we possess or lack in some abstract sense, but rather something we build through repetition and habit, the same way a musician develops skill through daily practice or an athlete develops strength through consistent training. When you practice choosing the virtuous response in small moments, you rewire your own capacity for virtue in larger moments, so that when genuine difficulty arrives, you have already trained your character to respond with wisdom rather than reactivity. What is remarkable about how we have normalized our relationship to personal growth is that we often treat philosophical understanding and behavioral change as entirely separate endeavors, studying wisdom as if it were meant only for contemplation, rather than recognizing that Musonius Rufus understood philosophy as a lived discipline, a daily practice no different in principle from brushing one's teeth or exercising the body. Consider the moment when you lie in bed at night, convinced that a particular belief you hold about yourself or the world is absolutely true and unchangeable. Yet you recall with perfect clarity that you held the opposite conviction with equal certainty at some other point in your life. This is the essential insight that the ancient Greek skeptic Aenesidemus attempted to capture through his systematic enumeration of 10 modes of skepticism, a framework designed to demonstrate that for any given proposition, an equally valid counterproposition can be constructed depending on the perspective from which we examine it. The 10 modes operate by examining how our judgments shift based on the nature of the observer, the conditions under which observation occurs, the mixing and blending of sensory impressions, the distances and positions involved, the quantities and qualities of what we perceive, the cultural and habitual contexts we inhabit, the frequencies of our experience, the mixing of emotions with our perceptions, the power and weakness of our own faculties, and the relative agreement or disagreement we find among different people and cultures. What emerges from contemplating these modes is a profound recognition that the stability we attribute to our convictions may be an illusion born from habit rather than from any genuine correspondence to an objective reality. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the human tendency to fix our attention on a single frame of reference, while ignoring the vast multiplicity of alternative frames that could yield opposite or contradictory conclusions about the very same phenomenon. Our mind naturally gravitates toward consistency and coherence, selecting evidence that confirms our existing worldview while unconsciously filtering out anomalies and contradictions that would complicate our comfortable narrative. Yet, despite understanding intellectually that perspective shapes perception, we continue to treat our current beliefs with the same certainty that we treated previous beliefs that we now recognize as limited or mistaken. Consider the moment when you lie in bed at night, troubled by a worry that feels absolutely real and pressing, a concern about tomorrow's meeting or a conversation you had weeks ago that still stings with embarrassment, and notice how this worry creates a sensation in your chest, a tightness that seems to prove the worry's validity, as if the physical sensation itself confirms the reality of the threat you are imagining. Sextus Empiricus, the ancient skeptical philosopher, would have gently separated these two things: the appearance of the worry and your immediate assumption that this appearance corresponds to something objectively true in the world. He taught that we experience appearances, which he called phenomena, but we have no certain knowledge that our appearances match reality as it truly exists independent of our perception. Your worry appears to you, yes, and the physical sensation appears to you as well, but neither appearance proves that your feared outcome will actually occur, yet we habitually treat our vivid internal experiences as direct windows into reality itself. The mechanism at work here is a collapse of categories, a conflation of appearance and truth that seems so natural we rarely notice it happening. Our nervous system generates sensations, our mind generates narratives, and because these phenomena feel immediate and powerful, we assume they are reliable guides to what is actually true about the future or about other people's thoughts toward us. Sextus Empiricus observed that this assumption requires us to make an invisible leap, a jump beyond what we can actually know with certainty, and yet we make this leap automatically, continuously, without deliberation. What is remarkable is how this pattern persists even when we understand it intellectually, how even after acknowledging that our worry might be unfounded, we still feel its weight as evidence, still treat the appearance as though it were truth itself, still organize our behavior around these mere phenomena as though they were proven facts about reality. Imagine yourself lying in the darkness of your bedroom, and gradually allow your mind to journey back through time to the ancient city of Alexandria in the 4th century, where a remarkable woman named Hypatia devoted her entire existence to the study of mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, believing that the universe itself was written in the language of numbers and geometric forms that could be understood through patient observation and rigorous thinking. Hypatia taught her students that the cosmos was not chaotic or arbitrary, but rather a perfectly ordered system governed by mathematical principles that extended from the smallest circle to the grandest celestial sphere, and that by understanding these principles through study and contemplation, one could find profound peace and harmony within oneself. The mechanism at work here is deeply rooted in the human need to find order within apparent complexity, to recognize that what seems random or overwhelming actually follows predictable patterns and laws, and that this recognition itself becomes a source of comfort because it transforms the unknown into something knowable and therefore less threatening to our sense of security. When we understand that the universe operates according to mathematical principles, our anxiety about chaos diminishes, and we begin to feel ourselves as part of an intelligible whole rather than isolated beings adrift in meaninglessness, which is precisely why ancient philosophers considered the study of mathematics and cosmology to be essential practices for achieving a tranquil mind. What persists across centuries is this remarkable human capacity to find serenity and understanding, to quiet our restless thoughts by discovering the hidden patterns that govern both the external world and our own internal experience. And we continue to seek this comfort today through science, philosophy, and contemplation. Drawing upon the same wellspring of wonder that moved Hypatia to gaze upward at the stars and recognize in their movements the same mathematical harmony that we now recognize within ourselves. Consider the moment when you find yourself reaching for something you know will cloud your mind or weigh upon your body, perhaps excess food late in the evening, a substance that dulls your awareness, or even the endless scroll of information that fragments your attention, and you pause instead, choosing restraint. This simple act of abstinence, of choosing not to indulge in what is readily available and culturally normalized, creates a peculiar clarity that seems almost unnatural in its quality, a sharpening of thought and perception that arrives swiftly once the fog of indulgence lifts. The 3rd century philosopher Porphyry, a student of Plotinus, understood that abstinence was not merely a moral practice but a cognitive technology, a method for refining the instrument of consciousness itself, and he observed that when we voluntarily restrict our consumption of things designed to stimulate and satisfy our lower impulses, we inadvertently create space for higher modes of thinking to emerge. The mechanism at work here is fundamentally about attention and energy. When the body is not engaged in processing excess stimulation or digestion, when the nervous system is not hyperactivated by constant sensory input or chemical stimulation, the mind naturally settles into a state of greater coherence and presence, and the thoughts that surface tend to be clearer, less reactive, more aligned with what we might call our deeper intentions. Yet despite the nearly universal human experience of feeling sharper and more mentally lucid after periods of restraint, we continue to normalize the opposite pattern, building entire economies and social structures around consistent indulgence, around the assumption that satisfaction and more are always preferable, even though the evidence of our own experience contradicts this at nearly every turn. And we persist in this contradiction with such consistency that we rarely even notice the gap between what we know to be true about our own minds and the way we actually live our daily lives. Imagine yourself in a state of profound stillness, where the boundary between your individual consciousness and the greater cosmic order begins to dissolve, and you find yourself engaging in a practice that the ancient Neoplatonic philosopher Aemblichus called theurgy, which literally means divine work or God working, a contemplative discipline that invited practitioners to align their inner being with celestial and divine principles through structured ritualistic thought and symbolic visualization. In this practice, rather than attempting to understand the divine through pure intellectual reasoning alone, as Plotinus had emphasized, you would instead work with sacred names, geometric patterns, and invocations designed to create a resonance between your consciousness and the hierarchical levels of reality that Iamblichus believed permeated existence, from the material realm all the way up through the celestial spheres to the transcendent source of all being. The mechanism operating beneath this approach rests upon a profound insight about how consciousness itself functions as a kind of tuning instrument that can be calibrated through ritual action and symbolic engagement. The idea being that when you contemplate sacred symbols or invoke divine names with genuine intention and focused attention, you are not merely performing empty gestures, but rather activating dormant pathways within your mind that connect you to deeper layers of meaning and cosmic order that exist beyond ordinary rational discourse. Consider the experience of watching a river flow downstream, observing how the water moves away from its source, yet understanding with complete certainty that this same water will eventually return to the ocean, evaporate into clouds, fall as rain upon distant mountains, and journey back through streams and tributaries to begin its endless cycle once more. This is the principle that the Neoplatonic philosopher Proclus called the doctrine of all returns, a meditation on the fundamental cyclicity embedded within existence itself, where nothing that departs truly leaves forever, where separation is always temporary, and where return is not merely possible but inevitable and necessary. When you lie in bed at night, your mind may feel scattered across countless worries, fragmented across past regrets and future anxieties. Yet this teaching suggests that your attention, like that river water, will inevitably return to its source, to the present moment, to your natural resting state, regardless of how far it has wandered into thought. The psychological mechanism underlying this principle reveals that our consciousness operates in cycles rather than linear progressions, that dispersal and gathering are alternating phases of a single rhythm, that every outward movement of attention contains within it the seed of return, just as the falling phase of a pendulum inherently contains the rising phase. We have normalized the anxiety of dispersion, telling ourselves that once our focus scatters or once we have moved away from peace, we may never find our way back. Yet this belief contradicts the observable pattern of all natural systems, where cycles complete themselves without exception, where the seasons return, where day follows night with mathematical precision, where the breath that leaves the body inevitably returns. Consider the moment when you lie in bed at night, exhausted from the day, and yet your mind refuses to settle into the peaceful darkness you desperately seek. You find yourself caught in a peculiar loop of thought, where you become aware that you are thinking about not being able to sleep, which itself prevents sleep from arriving, and this very awareness of the problem compounds the problem itself. This is the experience that Damascius, the final great philosopher of the Neoplatonic school in the 6th century, understood as the ultimate paradox of human consciousness. Damascius observed that skepticism, taken to its most rigorous extreme, does not liberate the mind, but rather traps it in an endless hall of mirrors where every attempt to grasp certainty becomes the very obstacle to peace. He recognized that the more desperately we seek to verify our thoughts, to confirm that our reasoning is sound, to ensure that we understand what is happening to us, the more elusive both understanding and rest become. The mechanism operates in your nervous system as a recursive loop of meta-awareness, where consciousness becomes aware of itself becoming aware of itself, creating layers upon layers of monitoring and doubt that activate the very same alertness systems that must be quieted for sleep to come. What Damascius discovered was that this final skepticism, this absolute questioning that refuses to accept any proposition without infinite examination, represents not wisdom, but a kind of philosophical paralysis that the human organism was never designed to sustain. We have normalized this state in modern life, treating perpetual doubt, constant verification, and endless mental review as marks of intelligence and conscientiousness, when in fact they are patterns that exhaust the mind and prevent the surrender necessary for genuine rest and peace to emerge naturally from within. In the 6th century of the Common Era, a philosopher named Simplicius sat in the great libraries of the ancient world, carefully transcribing the works of Aristotle and other classical thinkers, preserving their thoughts through the deliberate act of handwritten commentary and interpretation. Simplicius, working during a time when the Western Roman Empire had crumbled and the preservation of knowledge itself seemed uncertain, understood that the act of copying, annotating, and engaging deeply with philosophical texts was not merely an academic exercise, but rather a sacred responsibility to future generations who might otherwise lose access to centuries of accumulated wisdom. His commentaries were written with profound care, each word chosen to illuminate the original text, while simultaneously creating a bridge between the ancient world and whatever future awaited these precious ideas. The very physicality of this work, the hours spent bending over manuscripts, the constant vigilance against error, the commitment to accuracy despite fatigue and the deteriorating conditions of the late antique world, represented a form of philosophical practice in itself, a meditation on impermanence and the fragility of human knowledge. The mechanism underlying this impulse to preserve and comment is rooted in the recognition that understanding itself requires dialogue across time, that wisdom preserved in one era must be continually reinterpreted and made relevant to new contexts and new minds. By writing his commentaries, Simplicius was not merely copying dead knowledge, but participating in an ongoing conversation with Aristotle and with future readers, creating layers of meaning that accumulated like sediment in a riverbed. This layering of interpretation, this willingness to add one's own voice to the chorus of thinkers stretching backward and forward through time, reflects a fundamental philosophical stance that knowledge is never static, but always alive, always demanding fresh engagement and thoughtful reinterpretation. In the final years of his life, the Roman orator and statesman Marcus Tullius Cicero found himself stripped of political power, isolated from public life, and consumed by personal grief following the death of his beloved daughter Tullia. Rather than retreat into despair or seek distraction through the pleasures available to a man of his wealth and status, Cicero instead turned inward and began a series of philosophical dialogues with himself, which he later compiled into 5 books known as the Tusculan Disputations or Tusculan Consolations. These works represent his deliberate attempt to apply the ancient wisdom of the philosophers to the most difficult and pressing human experiences: grief, fear, pain, and the uncertainty of our place in the world. Cicero engaged directly with the Stoic principles that suggested our suffering arises not from external events themselves, but from the judgments we make about those events, and he explored how the disciplined examination of our beliefs and assumptions could fundamentally reshape our emotional experience. The mechanism underlying this ancient practice operates on a simple but profound principle, that by naming our pain explicitly, by examining it with reason rather than avoiding it, and by understanding that countless others have suffered similarly throughout human history, we create a kind of psychological distance from our distress. This distance is not escape, but rather perspective, a vantage point from which we can observe our own turmoil with some degree of equanimity. Yet despite knowing these principles intellectually, despite having seen them proven effective across centuries of philosophical practice, most people in moments of genuine sorrow still attempt to outrun their pain through distraction, denial, or the accumulation of external remedies. We live in an age that has normalized the avoidance of difficult emotions rather than the contemplation of them, creating a peculiar paradox where the most straightforward path to consolation remains the least traveled. Consider the person lying awake in the darkness, their mind circling endlessly around worst-case scenarios that have never happened and likely never will, their body tense with anticipatory dread about futures that exist only in imagination, their heart racing as though responding to an actual threat when the threat is merely a narrative they have constructed and are now believing as truth. This pattern of suffering repeats night after night, and the person remains convinced that their fears are protective, that their anxiety is necessary, that without this constant vigilance, something catastrophic will surely occur. Yet observe that throughout their entire life, the vast majority of feared events never materialize, and when difficult things do happen, they are rarely as devastating as the imagination had suggested, and the person somehow finds the capacity to endure and adapt far better than their anticipatory fears had predicted. The ancient Roman philosopher Lucretius understood something profound about this mechanism. He recognized that our fears are largely self-generated phantoms, products of an imagination that has been given too much power over our present moment, and that this power can be dissolved through clear reasoning about probability, about the actual evidence of our survival, and about the gap between imagined catastrophe and actual lived experience. What Lucretius observed is that fear persists not because it is logically justified, but because we have habituated ourselves to believing in its narrative, because we have made the stories of disaster feel real through repetition and emotional intensity, and because we have normalized this state of anticipatory suffering as though it were a necessary tax on existence. Yet we continue this pattern despite overwhelming evidence that our survival rate is remarkably high, that we have weathered countless moments of uncertainty before, and that the mind's catastrophic predictions are chronically unreliable. Consider the moment when you lie awake at night, your mind circling endlessly around a conversation you had hours earlier, replaying a comment someone made, imagining how you should have responded differently, constructing elaborate scenarios of regret and correction that exist nowhere but in the theater of your own consciousness. This is the human condition that Marcus Aurelius understood intimately when he wrote his private meditations late at night in military camps across the Roman Empire. The personal journals never intended for publication that have become our most profound window into the ancient practice of cognitive discipline. The mechanism at work here is deceptively simple, yet profoundly difficult to master. Your mind treats imagined slights and phantom conversations with the same emotional weight as real events, because the brain's threat detection system does not distinguish between actual danger and the narrative danger you construct through rumination. When you replay that social interaction for the 100th time, your nervous system remains slightly activated, your cortisol levels elevated, your sleep pushed further away with each cycle of mental return to the scene. Aurelius recognized that this private torment served no practical purpose, that the person who offended you is likely sleeping soundly while you remain trapped in a loop of your own creation, and that the energy expended on revision cannot change what has already occurred. Yet despite this logical clarity, despite knowing intellectually that worry accomplishes nothing except the theft of present peace, we continue the practice as though compelled by an invisible force, as though the act of mental rehearsal somehow prevents future embarrassment or grants us retroactive control over events that have already become history. The secret that Aurelius whispered to himself in those private midnight hours was simply this: that recognizing the futility of the loop is the first step toward breaking it, that naming the mechanism by which your mind holds you captive is the beginning of liberation from its grip. Imagine yourself walking through the darkness of an ancient street at night, carrying a small oil lamp before you, its flickering flame casting uncertain shadows on the cobblestones and walls around you. The lamp is fragile, easily extinguished by wind or careless movement, and yet you hold it aloft with considerable effort, your arm growing tired as you make your way forward. You might reasonably ask yourself why you expend such energy to carry this lamp when you could simply walk in darkness and allow your eyes to adjust, or when the destination itself is not so far that the darkness should truly impede your progress. Yet there you remain, lamp raised high, because something deeper than logic compels you to do so. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who himself lived in conditions of remarkable constraint and hardship, understood that we often carry burdens that serve primarily as symbols rather than necessities. The lamp, in his view, represents not illumination for external purposes alone, but the internal act of maintaining what we believe we should maintain, of performing the roles we have cast ourselves into, regardless of whether those roles serve our actual interests or contribute meaningfully to our well-being. We carry our lamps because we have learned that this is what responsible people do, what good people do, what people of our station and character do. We have internalized these expectations so thoroughly that they feel like natural laws rather than choices we have made. The mechanism operates through accumulated habit and social reinforcement. Each time we see others carrying lamps, each time we are praised for our own lamp carrying, each time we feel the subtle shame of imagining ourselves as someone who would neglect to carry a lamp, the pattern deepens. Yet if we pause and truly examine it, we recognize that many of our lamps illuminate nothing real, illuminate no genuine obstacle, solve no actual problem, and yet we continue to carry them forward into the night, year after year, believing this is simply how one must travel through existence. Consider the moment when you find yourself lying awake, caught between the desire to sleep and the racing activity of your thinking mind, and notice how often your thoughts create a bridge between emotion and language, between what you feel and what you tell yourself about what you feel. This phenomenon, which the ancient philosophers understood as the relationship between philo, meaning love or natural inclination, and logos, meaning word or reason, reveals itself most clearly in those twilight hours when your defenses are lowered and your internal dialogue becomes audible to your own awareness. You experience this bridge whenever you feel a subtle anxiety about tomorrow and immediately translate it into specific worried thoughts, or when you sense a vague sadness and then construct a narrative explanation for why you should feel this way, creating a linguistic structure that gives shape and weight to something that began as pure sensation or mood. The mechanism operates through a deeply embedded human capacity to make meaning through language, to bridge the gap between prelinguistic feeling and articulated thought, And this bridging process actually creates a feedback loop, where the words you use to describe your feelings then reinforce and amplify those very feelings, making them feel more real and more substantial than they were before you named them. What makes this process so persistent and so normalized in human consciousness is that it feels natural and necessary, as though translating emotion into language is simply how understanding works. Yet the ancient philosophers recognized that this bridge, while useful for communication and logical analysis, often creates unnecessary suffering by trapping fleeting emotional states in rigid linguistic forms that prevent them from moving and dissolving as they would naturally do in silence. Consider the ancient Christian theologian Origen of Alexandria, who proposed a radical and deeply consoling idea that would echo through centuries of spiritual thought, that ultimately all souls, without exception, would eventually return to God and experience salvation, even those suffering in the deepest torment of hell itself. This vision emerged not from naive optimism, but from a profound logical deduction rooted in divine omnipotence and eternal compassion. For if God possesses infinite power and infinite goodness, then a permanent state of damnation contradicts both these attributes, since eternal punishment would represent either a limitation on God's power to redeem or a contradiction of God's fundamental nature as love itself. Origen's concept of apokatastasis, or universal restoration, suggests that divine justice must ultimately triumph not through permanent exile, but through the eventual transformation and reconciliation of every conscious being, that even the devil himself might one day choose to return willingly to harmony with the divine source from which all creation emerged. The psychological mechanism underlying this philosophy rests upon a profound principle of compassion that transcends retributive justice, offering the human mind a framework through which to process suffering and evil without requiring the existence of eternal, purposeless torment, thereby reducing existential anxiety and the psychological burden of imagining a universe where any conscious being remains forever separated from wholeness and peace. Consider the ancient philosopher Numenius of Apatheia, who lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and his remarkable assertion that Plato was essentially Moses speaking in Greek, that the great Athenian philosopher had somehow absorbed or inherited the wisdom of the Hebrew lawgiver and repackaged it for the Mediterranean world. This claim, which seems absurd to modern ears, represented a genuine attempt to reconcile two vastly different intellectual traditions at a time when the boundaries between Greek philosophy and Judaic thought were becoming increasingly porous. Numenius was not being careless or whimsical, but rather engaging in what he believed to be serious intellectual work, suggesting that the deepest truths about reality, divinity, and the nature of the good life had been understood in different ways by different cultures, yet were fundamentally pointing toward the same ultimate reality. The psychological mechanism at work here involves what we might call the universalization impulse, the deep human need to believe that profound wisdom, once discovered or revealed, must necessarily transcend its original cultural context and appear again and again across different civilizations and epochs. This impulse arises from our intuition that truth is singular and eternal rather than multiple and contingent, that goodness and insight should not be the monopoly of any single people or tradition. Yet we rarely examine how this universalizing tendency can obscure the actual historical particularity and originality of different thinkers, how it can flatten genuine differences into artificial similarities and rob each tradition of its unique voice. We continue to do this work today, finding the same psychological truths in ancient Stoics and modern therapists, the same ethical principles in Buddha and Jesus, rarely pausing to consider whether our enthusiasm for universal wisdom might be preventing us from truly understanding what each tradition was actually trying to say within its own context. As you settle into rest, contemplate how the human mind seeks coherence and unity even when confronted with genuine difference and diversity. Consider the experience of lying in bed at night, your mind circling endlessly around problems you cannot solve in the darkness, replaying conversations from years past, imagining futures that may never arrive, and feeling the weight of existence pressing against your chest as you desperately seek the oblivion of sleep. This is the condition Albinus, the 2nd century Middle Platonist philosopher, addressed through his understanding of the divided mind and the hierarchy of being, a framework that suggests our waking anxieties stem from a fundamental misalignment between our perception of reality and reality itself. Albinus taught that the material world we perceive through our senses is merely a shadow of true being, that behind the chaos of physical existence lies an ordered, eternal realm of forms and intellect that remains undisturbed by the turbulence below. When we cannot sleep because our minds race with worry and rumination, we are experiencing what happens when consciousness becomes fixated on the lowest level of reality, the realm of shadows and fleeting impressions, mistaking temporary circumstances for ultimate truth and permanent conditions. The psychological mechanism at work is this. Our anxious thoughts gain power precisely because we grant them reality status, treating them as representations of things that truly matter, when in fact they are merely images projected onto the screen of consciousness by a mind not yet directed toward higher understanding. Yet despite knowing logically that most of our nighttime fears will seem insignificant in morning light, that the future scenarios we dread rarely materialize, and that our ruminations cannot actually control events, we continue to surrender ourselves to this exhausting mental habit, treating shadows as substances and mistaking the flickering images of fear for the stable reality of what actually is. Consider the experience of lying in bed at night, your mind naturally turning toward questions that have no immediate answer, questions about the nature of existence itself, about why certain patterns repeat in your life, about the relationship between your thoughts and reality, about what truly matters and what you have been taught to believe matters. Maximus of Tyre, the ancient Platonist philosopher, practiced what might be called the art of productive questioning, deliberately asking himself questions not to reach definitive answers, but to quiet the restless seeking of the mind by honoring its impulse to wonder. The mechanism at work here is subtle but profound. The human mind, when faced with a genuine question posed with sincerity, naturally enters a state of receptive contemplation rather than anxious problem-solving, because authentic philosophical questions do not demand solutions, but rather invite the mind to rest within the space of uncertainty itself. When you ask yourself a true question, one without a prescribed answer waiting in your memory, your mind releases its grip on the need to control outcomes and instead becomes curious, becomes open, becomes present to the moment. We have normalized the opposite impulse in our culture, training ourselves to treat every question as a problem requiring immediate resolution, as though uncertainty were a disease rather than the natural condition of consciousness. Yet Maximus understood that the deepest relaxation comes not from having answered all your questions, but from releasing the frantic energy of questioning itself into a state of gentle wondering. As you rest in darkness, you might pose to yourself his kinds of questions. What lies beneath my constant need to understand? What would it feel like to simply witness my thoughts without solving them? Who would I be if I accepted that some mysteries need not be penetrated? These are not questions seeking your response, but invitations for your mind to settle into a deeper rhythm, where the seeking itself becomes the answer, and the questioning becomes a form of rest. Imagine yourself wandering through a marketplace in ancient Rome, observing a man who has been transformed into a donkey, carrying heavy burdens and beaten by those around him, yet remaining aware within his animal form of his human consciousness and suffering, unable to communicate his true nature to anyone who might help him, forced to endure indignities and physical labor while trapped in a body that no longer matches his understanding of self. This is the central premise of Apuleius' Golden Ass, a work that explores the profound disconnect between who we believe ourselves to be internally and the external form or circumstance in which we find ourselves trapped, a transformation that occurs not through magic alone, but through the protagonist's own moral failings and spiritual ignorance. The psychological mechanism at work here operates on the principle that our sense of identity is far more fragile and dependent upon external validation than we typically acknowledge. For the protagonist's humanity persists entirely in his consciousness, while the world treats him as merely an animal, revealing that much of what we call ourself is simply a reflection of how others perceive and treat us. We persist in believing that our essence is solid and unchanging, that our true nature cannot be altered by circumstance or perception. Yet Apuleius demonstrates through his transformative narrative that we are constantly being reshaped by forces beyond our control, that our consciousness may remain intact while everything around us changes, and that the gap between internal awareness and external reality can become so profound as to constitute a kind of torment. Consider the ancient Roman philosopher Celsus, who lived during the 2nd century and possessed a vision of the universe as fundamentally rational, ordered, and governed by intelligible principles that the human mind could comprehend through careful observation and logical reasoning. He believed that the cosmos was not ruled by capricious gods or supernatural forces acting arbitrarily, but rather by natural laws that operated consistently and could be understood by those patient enough to study them carefully. When Celsus gazed at the night sky, he saw not chaos or divine mystery, but a kind of cosmic architecture where everything from the movements of planets to the growth of plants followed rational patterns that reflected an underlying intelligence in the structure of reality itself. This worldview offered profound psychological comfort because it suggested that the universe was knowable, that suffering and confusion arose from ignorance rather than malice, and that through understanding these rational principles, one could align oneself with the natural order and find peace. The mechanism behind this philosophical approach involves the deeply human tendency to find reassurance in comprehensibility, to feel less anxious when we can explain phenomena through reason rather than leaving them shrouded in mystery or attributing them to incomprehensible forces. When we understand how something works, we gain a sense of agency and control, even if that control is merely psychological or intellectual rather than practical. Yet what persists today is our normalized version of this same impulse, where we still crave rational explanations for everything around us, where we still experience relief when chaos can be categorized and understood, where we still believe that consciousness and logic are the ultimate keys to navigating existence. Even as we sleep, the part of our mind that seeks this rational order continues its work, seeking patterns in memory and finding comfort in the belief that underneath all apparent randomness lies a comprehensible structure waiting to be discovered by those with sufficient clarity of thought. In the 4th century of the Common Era, there lived a Roman emperor named Julian who possessed an unusual and deeply conflicted mind, a man who inherited the throne of the most powerful empire on earth, yet spent his reign attempting to reverse the spiritual direction of an entire civilization. And in doing so, he embodied a particular kind of psychological torment that speaks directly to anyone who has ever felt fundamentally at odds with the world around them. Julian was born into a Christian imperial family, educated in Christian doctrine, and yet through his studies of ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, he became convinced that the old pagan ways represented a superior path to meaning, virtue, and truth. And he spent his brief years as emperor attempting to restore polytheism and philosophical paganism to prominence while suppressing the growing Christian faith that had become woven into the very fabric of Roman society. What makes Julian's story philosophically significant is not merely his actions, but the internal mechanism of his conflict, for he was fighting against something far more powerful than any army or institution, something far more resilient than any law or decree, and that something was the psychological momentum of cultural transformation, the way that ideas, once they begin to spread through a population, become normalized, become assumed, become invisible in their ubiquity. Making any attempt to reverse them feel like pushing against an invisible current that grows stronger the more you struggle against it. In the quiet hours of late antiquity, a scholar named Themistius engaged in what seemed like a humble practice of rewriting the works of Aristotle into more accessible forms, creating paraphrases that simplified complex philosophical arguments without claiming to replace the originals. Yet these paraphrases became so widely distributed and so thoroughly integrated into the intellectual fabric of Byzantine and Islamic philosophy that they fundamentally altered how entire generations understood the original texts themselves. What began as an act of clarification and pedagogical kindness gradually transformed into something more subtle and pervasive. The paraphrase became the lens through which people encountered Aristotle, not as a supplement to the primary source, but as a filter that shaped perception so completely that readers often could not distinguish between what Aristotle originally meant and what Themistius had emphasized or reinterpreted. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the human mind's natural tendency to accept the most readily available version of information as representative of the whole, a cognitive pattern where repeated exposure to a secondary interpretation creates what researchers call source confusion, wherein the mediating voice becomes indistinguishable from the original voice in memory and understanding. When we read a paraphrase often enough, with sufficient authority and widespread endorsement behind it, our minds consolidate that paraphrase with the source material itself, and over time, we lose the ability to remember that there ever was a difference between the interpretation and the thing interpreted. In the quiet hours before sleep, When your mind begins to drift between wakefulness and unconsciousness, you may notice that your thoughts become increasingly abstract and symbolic, less bound by the rigid logic of daytime reasoning and more fluid in their associations and meanings. Synesius of Cyrene, a 4th-century Christian philosopher and bishop, observed this liminal state with extraordinary precision and developed a sophisticated understanding of dreams not as mere random neural activity or meaningless nighttime phantoms, but as a profound form of knowledge and spiritual insight that operates according to its own internal logic. He recognized that dreams function as a special language through which the soul communicates with itself, a realm where the boundaries between the material and immaterial worlds become permeable, and where truth can be accessed through intuition and symbolic understanding rather than through rational analysis alone. The mechanism underlying this philosophy rests on the observation that the sleeping mind, freed from the constant surveillance and censorship of rational thought, allows deeper layers of consciousness to express themselves more authentically, revealing truths about our desires, fears, and spiritual condition that the waking mind often obscures or refuses to acknowledge. Synesius understood that dreams follow their own grammar, one that is not deficient or inferior to waking logic, but rather fundamentally different, operating through resonance, simultaneity, and symbolic condensation rather than through sequential cause and effect. Yet despite the profound validity of this ancient insight, modern culture has relegated dreams to the margins of meaningful experience, treating them as curiosities to be analyzed therapeutically at best or dismissed as neurological noise at worst, even as we continue to be moved by them, to remember them, to find them strangely persuasive and meaningful in ways we struggle to explain rationally. In the 4th century, the Roman philosopher and commentator Macrobius preserved for posterity a remarkable dialogue known as the Dream of Scipio, originally written by Cicero centuries before, which describes a vision experienced by the younger Scipio Africanus in which he encounters his grandfather and is shown the celestial mechanics of the universe, the orbits of planets, and the music of the spheres that governs all creation. The dream functions as a sophisticated pedagogical tool, a narrative device through which abstract philosophical and astronomical knowledge is transmitted not through dry exposition, but through the intimate, emotionally resonant medium of a dream vision, allowing the reader to absorb complex cosmological truths while in a state of receptive imagination rather than defensive skepticism. Macrobius understood what modern sleep researchers have only recently begun to confirm, that the mind in dreams operates according to different rules than waking consciousness, rendering it paradoxically more capable of grasping certain truths, particularly those involving vast scales, interconnection, and cosmic order that the rational daytime mind finds difficult to hold without fragmenting into specialization and doubt. The mechanism works because dreams bypass the critical faculty that normally filters and judges, creating instead a state of pure receptivity where ideas can unfold with their own internal logic, where the grandfather figure represents inherited wisdom and continuity across generations, and where ascending through the heavens mirrors an ascent through layers of understanding. In the late 4th century, a Roman writer named Marcianus Capella composed an allegorical work that would shape the intellectual framework of the medieval world for over 1,000 years, a text in which he organized human knowledge into 7 distinct disciplines that he called the 7 liberal arts, consisting of grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, each personified as a beautiful maiden attending the wedding of Mercury and philology. A seemingly whimsical narrative device that actually encoded a profound understanding of how the human mind processes reality through organized patterns and systematic categories. The genius of Capella's schema lay not merely in what he included, but in the hierarchical architecture he established, dividing the arts into the trivium, those 3 disciplines concerned with words and expression and interpretation, and the quadrivium, those 4 disciplines rooted in mathematical and cosmological truths, suggesting that mastery of language must precede mastery of the material world, that rhetoric and grammar are tools by which we even access mathematics and astronomy. What emerges from careful consideration of this 7-fold system is the recognition that human consciousness does not encounter knowledge as an undifferentiated whole, but rather compartmentalizes experience into manageable domains, each with its own rules and patterns and internal logics, and that by consciously mapping these domains and understanding their relationships, we create a stable framework through which chaos becomes comprehensible and anxiety diminishes in the face of organized structure. In the quiet hours before sleep, when the mind begins to drift toward the threshold of unconsciousness, we might find ourselves contemplating the work of Chalcidius, a late antique philosopher and translator who preserved for Western civilization the Timaeus of Plato, one of the most profound meditations on the nature of the cosmos ever committed to written form. Chalcidius, working in the 4th century of the Common Era, undertook the painstaking task of translating Plato's dialogue into Latin, accompanied by his own extensive commentary that sought to reconcile Platonic thought with the emerging frameworks of Christian theology and Neoplatonic philosophy. This act of translation itself embodies a philosophical principle that quiets the restless mind. The idea that knowledge and wisdom are not possessions to be hoarded, but rather gifts to be transmitted across generations and cultures, flowing like water from one vessel to another, adapting its shape but retaining its essential nature. The Timaeus speaks of a demiurge, a divine craftsman who shapes the cosmos according to eternal forms and mathematical harmonies, and in contemplating this vision through Chalcidius's careful Latin prose, we encounter a cosmology that presents the universe not as chaos or accident, but as an ordered, intentional creation governed by reason and proportion. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the profound comfort that emerges when we perceive the world as fundamentally rational and purposeful, when we understand that behind the apparent disorder of existence there exists an underlying mathematics, a hidden geometry that gives meaning to every atom and every motion. Consider the experience of falling asleep while listening to someone speak words of genuine praise, encouragement, or gentle wisdom, the way the ancient Romans imagined Favonius, the god of the west wind, might whisper kind words into the ears of those who had grown weary from the day's struggles, and how this peculiar phenomenon reveals something profound about the architecture of human consciousness and vulnerability. When we are exhausted and our rational defenses have begun to lower themselves like the gates of a fortress at dusk, we become remarkably susceptible to receiving positive affirmation, to the point where hearing kind words directed toward us with sincerity can actually facilitate the transition into sleep more effectively than silence or neutral tones. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the ancient human need for social validation and belonging, which operates on a frequency so fundamental that it bypasses our critical thinking faculties when we are in a state of semi-consciousness, allowing the emotional and social parts of our brain to relax their vigilance and permit the body to enter restorative sleep. What makes this particularly curious is that we maintain this susceptibility throughout our entire lives, despite our intellectual understanding that words of praise are not inherently different whether we are awake or drowsy, yet we continue to experience profound relaxation when receiving gentle affirmation, as though some deeper part of ourselves recognizes that being valued by others, or even imagining such valuation, creates the neurochemical conditions necessary for profound rest. In the quiet hours before sleep, consider the ancient philosopher Chalcidius and his remarkable attempt to map the architecture of the cosmos, a vision that emerged from the classical world and persisted through centuries of intellectual transmission. Chalcidius, a 4th-century thinker whose work has largely faded from immediate recognition, devoted his considerable energies to translating and commenting upon Plato's Timaeus, one of the most enigmatic and influential dialogues in Western philosophy, and in doing so he constructed an elaborate framework for understanding how the universe itself is organized and animated. He envisioned the cosmos as fundamentally alive, organized by divine intelligence, composed of celestial spheres that move in perfect mathematical harmony, with each sphere carrying the heavenly bodies and contributing to an overall symphony of motion that governs all earthly existence. The mechanism underlying this vision rests upon a compelling but ultimately metaphysical assumption, that the universe must be rational and ordered because a rational mind created it, and therefore by studying mathematics and geometry, we can unveil the mind of the Creator embedded within creation itself. This represents a profoundly human impulse to locate meaning and intelligence at the heart of existence, to see ourselves not as accident but as participants in a grand design that contains wisdom and purpose. Yet despite the absence of empirical verification, this framework persisted for centuries because it offered something far more valuable than mere explanation. It provided comfort, coherence, and a sense that our place in the world was neither random nor insignificant, that the very mathematics describing planetary motion was the same mathematics that could organize human society and the human soul, creating a unified vision of existence from the infinitely large to the infinitely small. In the 3rd century of the Common Era, there existed a philosopher of such profound influence that almost nothing he wrote survives to us today. Yet his students became some of the most celebrated intellectual figures of antiquity, and what we know of his teachings comes almost entirely through the written accounts of others, primarily his most famous student Plotinus, who would go on to establish Neoplatonism as a dominant philosophical school that shaped centuries of Western and Eastern thought. Ammonius Saccas taught in Alexandria, one of the ancient world's greatest centers of learning, and he apparently insisted that his deepest teachings remain unwritten, existing only in the living exchange between teacher and student, passed through spoken word and direct dialogue rather than committed to the permanence of papyrus or parchment. This choice reveals something fundamental about how knowledge itself can operate, for there is a particular quality to understanding that emerges in the moment of direct encounter between minds, in the breathing space of conversation where clarification happens immediately, where misunderstanding can be caught and corrected in real time, where the teacher can sense the student's readiness and adjust the transmission accordingly. The mechanism underlying this practice suggests that certain truths cannot be adequately captured in static text, that language frozen on a page loses the dynamism and responsiveness necessary to convey genuine insight, and that the highest forms of knowledge may require the presence and attention of a living consciousness responding to another living consciousness. Yet in our contemporary world, we have largely normalized the opposite assumption, that what matters most must be documented, published, preserved in retrievable form, made available to the masses through printed books and digital databases, as though the permanence of the written word guarantees the authenticity of the understanding it contains. Consider the moment when you encounter something so vast, so perfectly crafted, or so overwhelmingly beautiful that your breath catches in your throat and your sense of ordinary time dissolves entirely. Perhaps you stand before a mountain at dawn, watching light break across an impossible expanse of stone and shadow, or you hear music that seems to contain something beyond sound itself, something that reaches into your chest and quiets every anxious thought. In that instant, you are not thinking about your worries or the tasks awaiting you tomorrow. You are suspended in a state of profound awe that the ancient critic Longinus called the sublime. This quality exists not merely in the object before you, but in the precise alignment between what you are perceiving and your capacity to be moved by greatness itself. The sublime arrives when language, form, or nature reaches beyond decoration and polish into something that touches what is highest and most noble within human consciousness. When you witness true grandeur, whether in a perfectly constructed sentence that captures an eternal truth or in the sweep of stars across a winter sky, your mind becomes temporarily incapable of its usual chatter and resistance. The mechanism at work here reveals something profound about human awareness itself. We are capable of transcendence when we encounter authenticity and magnitude without pretense. The sublime does not whisper to us. It speaks in a voice so clear and so powerful that our defenses temporarily cease their endless vigilance. We have somehow normalized the idea that beauty and greatness should feel distant or precious, something we must earn or deserve, yet Longinus understood that sublimity is available whenever we truly attend to excellence. The quiet mind that drifts toward sleep often finds its deepest rest not through forced relaxation, but through the gentle memory of having been moved by something greater than its own concerns, allowing consciousness itself to release its grip. Consider the moment when you find yourself lying in bed, your mind restless and unable to settle, cycling through thoughts about tomorrow's obligations, past conversations replayed with uncomfortable clarity, and an endless inventory of small worries that somehow feel magnified in the darkness. The ancient philosopher Moderatus, who lived in the 2nd century and built upon Pythagorean traditions, understood that this mental agitation stems from our tendency to treat all thoughts as equally real and demanding of our attention, when in fact most thoughts are merely echoes of habit rather than genuine necessities requiring our engagement. Moderatus taught that consciousness operates on different levels, much like musical harmonies stacked upon one another, and that the surface level where our anxious thoughts churn is merely the lowest register, not the deepest truth of our being. When you lie awake, your mind is performing what might be called the lowest harmony, the most discordant frequency, where every concern seems acute and every uncertainty seems urgent. Yet if you could perceive the deeper harmonies beneath this surface agitation, you would recognize that your essential self exists in a realm untouched by these circling preoccupations, a place of fundamental stillness that the ancient Pythagoreans called the harmony of the spheres. The remarkable psychological mechanism at work here is that by consciously acknowledging that your anxious thoughts belong to this surface level of consciousness, you create subtle psychological distance from them, allowing them to lose their grip on your nervous system. We have normalized sleeplessness as an inevitable modern condition, accepting it as the natural consequence of contemporary life. Yet we rarely question whether this acceptance itself perpetuates the problem by preventing us from accessing the deeper philosophical calm that Moderatus insisted was always available to those willing to recognize the hierarchical layers of their own mind. Consider the ancient mathematician Nicomachus of Gerasa, who discovered a remarkable pattern within the architecture of numbers themselves, a pattern so elegant and inevitable that it seemed to reveal something sacred about the mathematical fabric of reality. He observed that when you take consecutive odd numbers and arrange them in groups, their sums always produce perfect cubes, a discovery so profound that it connected the seemingly chaotic realm of odd integers to the harmonious geometry of three-dimensional space. The first odd number 1 sums to 1, which is 1 cubed. The next two odd numbers 3 and 5 sum to 8, which is 2 cubed. The next three odd numbers 7, 9, and 11 sum to 27, which is 3 cubed, and this pattern continues infinitely without exception or deviation. What made this discovery particularly compelling to ancient minds was not merely its mathematical accuracy, but the psychological sense of underlying order it provided, the reassurance that chaos dissolves into pattern when viewed from the proper perspective. Nicomachus and his followers felt they had glimpsed something transcendent, a glimpse into the divine architecture of creation itself, because the pattern suggested that reality operates according to principles that are simultaneously discoverable and immutable. Yet what is truly remarkable is how we continue to experience this same psychological phenomenon in our modern age, even after stripping away the sacred and mystical language, still finding comfort and peace in mathematical patterns and logical structures that reveal hidden coherence beneath apparent randomness. We normalize this impulse by calling it scientific understanding or intellectual satisfaction, yet the underlying psychological mechanism remains unchanged since ancient times. For when we discover that chaos resolves into order, that disparate elements unite in unexpected harmony, the human mind experiences a profound settling, a sense of rightness that quiets anxiety and allows the body to relax into deeper rest. In the schools of the ancient Neo-Pythagoreans, initiates were required to observe extended periods of complete silence, sometimes lasting years, before they were permitted to study the deeper teachings of mathematics, metaphysics, and the nature of the universe itself. During these silent years, students would listen to lectures from behind screens or in separate chambers, absorbing knowledge without the ability to ask questions, debate, or voice their confusion. And this practice was not considered punishment, but rather preparation of the mind for understanding truths that words themselves could never adequately convey. The mechanism at work within this discipline is profoundly subtle and operates on multiple levels simultaneously. First, enforced silence strips away the habitual tendency of the mind to externalize its thoughts through speech, which in itself creates a kind of psychological momentum that prevents genuine introspection. And when we cannot speak our thoughts, we begin to examine them instead, to notice their texture and origin rather than simply releasing them into the world as if they were established facts. Second, the absence of dialogue removes the ego's constant need to defend, elaborate, and reinforce its positions through argument and discourse, creating space for the mind to hold contradictory ideas simultaneously without immediately collapsing them into certainty or dismissing them as false. Third, and perhaps most profoundly, silence itself becomes a teacher, communicating through the gaps between thoughts what language cannot access, and the Neo-Pythagoreans understood that the deepest truths of mathematics and cosmology revealed themselves not through words, but through the quality of attention that silence cultivates. Consider the ancient Platonic philosopher Xenocrates, who believed that numbers possessed inherent forms and qualities that extended far beyond mere mathematical calculation, a perspective that invites us to contemplate how we assign meaning and structure to the abstract symbols that govern our understanding of reality. In his system of thought, numbers were not simply tools for counting or measuring physical objects, but rather they were living principles that shaped the very nature of existence itself, each number carrying with it a distinct character, purpose, and influence that rippled through both the visible and invisible worlds. When we observe modern life, we find ourselves constantly surrounded by numbers that hold remarkable power over our emotional and psychological states. From the obsessive checking of digital notifications and social media accounts to the way we monitor our bank balances, our body weight, our productivity metrics, and our calendar days with an intensity that suggests these figures possess almost mystical significance. The mechanism at work here is deeply rooted in our need for order and predictability in a chaotic universe. For numbers offer us the comforting illusion that reality can be quantified, controlled, and understood through rational means. And when we assign numerical values to aspects of our lives, we unconsciously grant them a kind of legitimacy and power that transforms them from mere information into sources of validation or anxiety. When Plato died in the year 347 before the Common Era, his academy in Athens faced an unexpected succession. For Plato had chosen not his most brilliant student Aristotle, but rather his own nephew Speusippus to lead the philosophical community he had spent his life constructing. This decision, which seemed to many of his contemporaries a curious withdrawal from meritocratic principle, reveals a profound truth about how institutions perpetuate themselves regardless of the competence of their leaders. Speusippus inherited not merely a school but an entire apparatus of legitimacy, a treasury of goodwill, and an established curriculum that would continue functioning through sheer institutional momentum, even as his philosophical contributions proved considerably less innovative than those of his uncle or his rival Aristotle. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon rests upon the human tendency to conflate proximity to greatness with possession of greatness itself, and to assume that inheritance of position correlates reliably with inheritance of insight. We observe that students came to study under Speusippus not because his original theories surpassed those of his competitors, but because the academy bore Plato's name and Speusippus bore Plato's blood and had received Plato's formal appointment. The institution continued to thrive, students continued to pay their fees, and philosophy continued to be taught from the same location under the same roof, all of this occurring in the curious absence of a revolutionary intellect at the helm. What remains most striking about this historical moment is how thoroughly we have normalized this pattern in our own institutions and hierarchies, how we accept without question that leadership often descends to the competent rather than the exceptional, and how systems perpetuate themselves through structural inertia long after the animating genius that created them has departed from the world. Imagine yourself in the library of ancient Alexandria, surrounded by scrolls and the weight of philosophical tradition, and you encounter a scholar named Crantor who lived around 315 before the Common Era, a figure whose primary contribution to Western thought was not the creation of an entirely new system, but rather the act of careful commentary upon the work of Plato. And in doing so, Crantor became perhaps the first systematic interpreter of philosophical texts, establishing a practice that would transform how knowledge itself would be preserved, transmitted, and understood across centuries. What Crantor understood, and what made his approach revolutionary in a quiet and unassuming way, was that philosophical wisdom does not merely exist in isolated moments of revelation or in the pages of original works, but rather lives and breathes through the process of contemplative engagement with those works, the patient unpacking of layers of meaning, the asking of questions that the original author may not have explicitly answered. His commentaries on Plato were not merely summaries or restatements, but thoughtful dialogues with the text itself, acknowledging that the act of reading and interpreting is itself a form of philosophical practice, requiring intellectual humility and genuine curiosity. The psychological mechanism at work here operates on a profound level, for by choosing to comment rather than to originate, Crantor revealed a truth about knowledge itself. That understanding often emerges not from the bold assertion of new ideas, but from the patient, rigorous examination of existing ones, from the willingness to sit with complexity and resist the urge to simplify. Yet despite the inherent value and dignity of this interpretive work, throughout history we have tended to celebrate the original thinkers and minimize the role of the careful commentators, those scholars who devoted their intellectual lives to deepening our understanding of great works. And this bias toward originality has persisted so thoroughly that we rarely recognize how much of our own thinking depends upon such interpretive traditions. Consider the ordinary person moving through their day, constantly aware of how they appear to others, adjusting their posture when entering a room, modulating their voice when speaking to strangers, choosing their words with calculated precision to maintain an image of competence and control, all while simultaneously carrying the exhausting burden of this performed self that never truly aligns with their inner experience. Pullman of the Stoic tradition understood that this fractured existence, this constant gap between who we are and who we pretend to be, creates a persistent tension in the mind and body that makes genuine rest impossible, for the mind cannot relax when it must remain vigilant about the performance of normalcy. The mechanism at work here reveals itself gradually as we examine it. We have internalized a belief that our natural self is somehow insufficient, that the authentic expressions of our fatigue, our desires, our genuine thoughts and movements would somehow be rejected or judged harshly by those around us. So we maintain an elaborate costume of acceptability that demands constant energy expenditure and vigilant self-monitoring. What becomes remarkable is how thoroughly this artificial existence has been normalized in modern life, how we have come to accept the perpetual tension as simply the cost of existing in society, how we describe people who live more naturally and authentically as eccentric or unprofessional rather than recognizing them as psychologically liberated. Yet Pullman suggests that the path to a quieter mind, particularly one capable of descending into genuine sleep, requires a gradual return to naturalness in our daily conduct, a slow unwinding of the need to perform, a recognition that living with less pretense and more authenticity actually generates the calm that our accumulated fatigue has been desperately seeking. As you rest with this reflection, notice how your body responds when you imagine simply being yourself without modification, without strategy, without the constant invisible performance that has become so habitual you no longer recognize it as effort at all. Consider the evening when you lie in bed carrying the weight of the day's small failures, replaying moments of social awkwardness or professional shortcomings, feeling the heaviness of expectation pressing against your chest as you attempt to find rest. The Cynic philosopher Crates of Thebes, who lived in ancient Athens during the 4th century before the Common Era, discovered something peculiar about this burden we carry, that much of its weight comes not from the actual consequences of our actions, but from our attachment to how others perceive us and our desperate need to maintain a certain image of ourselves in the world. Crates, who was actually quite wealthy by birth, made the radical choice to renounce his fortune and walk the streets in tattered clothing, teaching that freedom came not from accumulating more comfort or status, but from releasing the psychological chains we forge when we bind ourselves to vanity and social approval. The mechanism at work here is subtle but profound. When you strip away the need to impress, when you cease performing the self you believe others expect to see, a curious lightness emerges in the mind, a release of the constant internal tension that arises from maintaining an image. Most of us, however, have normalized this exhausting performance so completely that we no longer recognize it as a burden at all, having integrated the weight so thoroughly into our sense of identity that we mistake it for our actual self. We defend our need to appear successful, competent, and worthy of admiration as though these performances were inevitable rather than chosen. Yet Crates demonstrated through his own life that this framework is entirely optional, that one can simply set it down like an unnecessary cloak and walk more freely through existence. As you rest tonight, you might consider which burdens you carry not because they serve you, but because you have never seriously imagined putting them down. Consider the peculiar human tendency to construct elaborate systems of meaning around things that ultimately serve no practical purpose. And Bion of Borysthenes, an ancient Greek philosopher of the Cynic school, devoted much of his intellectual energy to exposing this very contradiction through sharp satirical observation and pointed ridicule. Bion walked through the ancient world making deliberately absurd comments about human behavior, mocking the way people clung to social conventions, religious rituals, and philosophical doctrines with an intensity that bore no relationship to any genuine benefit these practices might provide. And he did this not out of mere cruelty, but out of a desire to wake people from their complacent acceptance of inherited nonsense. The psychological mechanism at work here involves what we might call the normalization of inherited complexity, wherein we accept the frameworks handed down to us by previous generations without questioning whether these frameworks actually solve the problems they claim to address. And in fact, the more elaborate and sophisticated a system becomes, the more we tend to assume it must contain profound wisdom simply by virtue of its complexity. When being observed wealthy people performing elaborate religious ceremonies, accumulating status symbols, or debating fine points of philosophical doctrine, he recognized that these behaviors persisted not because evidence demonstrated their efficacy, but because social reinforcement had transformed them into what felt like natural expressions of being human. And so people continued participating in these systems even when examined honestly. They seemed to amount to elaborate theater with no real payoff. Consider the moment when a person receives news of profound loss or rejection, and yet finds themselves strangely unmoved, as though the emotional weight that should accompany such events has simply failed to arrive. This was the paradoxical condition that ancient Cynic philosopher Thales explored in his Meditations on Exile, describing a state where a man cast out from his homeland, stripped of citizenship and community, continued about his day with the same mild indifference he might have shown toward changing weather. He walked the same streets, spoke with the same acquaintances, ate the same bread, yet carried the burden of permanent displacement without the expected anguish that society insisted he must feel. The psychological mechanism operating here rests on a subtle separation between the event itself and our interpretation of its significance, a gap so narrow that we rarely notice it exists at all. When we experience loss, we do not actually suffer from the loss directly, but rather from our judgment about the loss, from our insistence that it means something terrible, that it diminishes us, that it represents a genuine catastrophe in the architecture of our lives. Thales taught that exile, like poverty or illness, possesses no intrinsic power to disturb the mind of a person who refuses to grant it that power through their own narrative and attachment. The exiled man remains himself, retains his faculties, his capacity for thought and virtue, his ability to walk and speak and reason. These fundamental capacities remain entirely unchanged by geographical displacement or political status. Yet despite the logical clarity of this understanding, we persist in treating external circumstances as though they possess magical influence over our inner tranquility, creating suffering through judgment rather than experience actual harm through circumstance. The quiet secret Thales whispered across centuries is that indifference to exile is not coldness or numbness, but rather a rational assessment that refuses to manufacture distress where genuine distress need not exist. In the ancient Greek city of Megalopolis during the 3rd century before the Common Era, there lived a poet and politician named Cercidas who possessed an unusual preoccupation for his time. He became deeply disturbed by the sight of wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, while the majority of people labored in poverty and desperation. Rather than accepting this arrangement as the natural order of things, as most of his contemporaries did, Cercidas began to question the moral foundation upon which such inequality rested, and he used his position and his words to advocate for a more equitable distribution of resources among all citizens. His philosophical insight operated on a simple but radical principle: that extreme disparity in material conditions creates unnecessary suffering, that hoarding wealth beyond genuine need serves no purpose except to feed the ego of the wealthy, and that a stable society requires some baseline of shared prosperity and dignity for all members. The mechanism at work in Cercidas's thinking was recognition that humans tend to accept inherited structures and social arrangements, without examining whether those structures actually serve the common good or merely perpetuate the power of those already advantaged by them. He understood that inequality persists not because it is logically justified or practically necessary, but because those who benefit from it have the power to define what seems normal, reasonable, and inevitable to everyone else. What remains striking about Cercidas across the centuries is how his concern for social justice was considered eccentric and even dangerous in his own time, yet the contradictions he identified have never been resolved. We continue to normalize vast wealth disparities, continue to accept explanations for inequality that crumble under scrutiny, continue to arrange our societies in ways that benefit the few while the many endure preventable hardship. In the ancient city of Sinope, there lived a philosopher named Menippus who became known throughout the Hellenistic world not for solemn treatises or rigid doctrines, but for his practice of laughing at the things most people took seriously. Menippus would wander the streets observing the ambitious merchant chasing wealth he could never fully secure, the politician pursuing power that would inevitably slip from his grasp, the scholar memorizing facts that would eventually be forgotten, and he would laugh not out of cruelty, but out of a peculiar form of clarity. His laughter was not the laughter of mockery alone, but rather the laughter of someone who had seen through the elaborate pretense that gives human life its sense of meaning and urgency. He recognized that people spent their entire existence pursuing outcomes they believed to be of supreme importance, yet these very outcomes were either temporary, illusory, or fundamentally insignificant in the larger scope of existence. The psychological mechanism underlying Menipus's laughter was rooted in what we might call cognitive dissonance resolution through acceptance rather than struggle. Most people experience anxiety when confronted with life's fundamental uncertainties and the eventual meaninglessness of their pursuits, and they resolve this tension by doubling down on the pursuit itself, by convincing themselves more firmly of its importance. Menipus instead resolved the tension by releasing his attachment to the outcome entirely, which paradoxically liberated him to observe the human condition with detached amusement. What remains striking across the centuries is how thoroughly we have normalized the very behaviors Menipus found laughable, how we continue to invest tremendous emotional energy into outcomes we consciously know to be temporary or uncertain, and how rarely we pause to acknowledge this fundamental contradiction between what we believe intellectually and how we actually live day by day. Demetrius of Phalerum was a Hellenistic philosopher and statesman who lived in the 3rd century before the Common Era, a man whose life embodied a profound truth about the nature of fortune and the fragility of human circumstance that remains strangely relevant to our modern anxieties about security and status. He rose to considerable prominence in Athens, serving as the governor of the city under Macedonian rule, wielding significant political power and accumulating wealth that seemed to cement his position as a man of lasting importance and influence. Yet his story took a dramatic and instructive turn when he was forced to flee Athens and spend his final years in exile in Egypt, stripped of his authority and the social position he had worked so carefully to establish. The psychological mechanism at work in Demetrius's experience reveals something that our minds persistently resist understanding despite its historical repetition: that external circumstances and social status, no matter how solidly they appear to be constructed, rest upon conditions entirely beyond individual control, and that the confidence we place in these external scaffoldings is fundamentally misplaced. We observe this pattern throughout history and even in our contemporary lives, where individuals invest their sense of self-worth and peace of mind into positions, possessions, and social standing, believing these things represent permanent achievements and reliable sources of identity. Yet Demetrius's fall demonstrates the illusion inherent in this arrangement. What persists despite the logical clarity of this lesson is our continued tendency to organize our inner peace around precisely these unstable external factors, to believe that if we could only secure the right position, accumulate sufficient resources, or achieve adequate social recognition, then we would finally experience lasting contentment and freedom from worry. In the ancient world, when loss struck a household with sudden force, the bereaved would find themselves overwhelmed by a particular kind of pain that seemed to have no remedy, a grief so vast and consuming that it threatened to dissolve the very foundations of their daily existence. Crantor, a Greek philosopher of the Academy, observed this universal human experience and recognized something peculiar within it. That grief, while seemingly endless in its intensity, was not actually endless in its nature, and that the mind possessed a quiet capacity to gradually soften what initially appeared unbearable. He developed a philosophical approach, suggesting that through rational contemplation and gentle acceptance of loss, rather than violent resistance to it, the mourner could find a path toward what he called measured sorrow, a state where one could honor the deceased and acknowledge the reality of absence without being completely consumed by the emotional weight of that absence. The mechanism at work here operates on a principle both simple and profound. When we struggle desperately against pain, we amplify it through resistance, but when we acknowledge it fully, look at it without flinching, and accept that this is now the texture of our lives, something begins to shift in how we carry it. What remains puzzling, and what Crantor himself seemed aware of, is how this truth becomes so difficult to access in the moment of deepest grief, even though countless individuals before us have walked this same path and returned to the possibility of living. We somehow forget in our darkest hours that human beings possess an almost miraculous capacity to integrate loss, to make space for absence within ourselves, and to eventually find that the sharp edge of grief has worn smooth over time, not because we have forgotten or betrayed the one we lost, but because we have finally stopped demanding that our hearts remain as broken as they were on the first terrible day.